Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the little corner of the internet where big ideas are allowed to arrive slowly, where science, history, and the strange habits of human beings are all invited in, asked to take off their muddy shoes, and encouraged to speak in a quieter voice. Tonight, we're settling in with a topic that sounds a bit dramatic at first, perhaps even a little rude to several centuries of textbooks, museum labels, and very confident documentaries. Because we're going to spend some time with the possibility that much of what we think we know about human history may be incomplete, oversimplified, poorly arranged, or in some cases just plain wrong. Not wrong in the sense that nothing happened, or that every ancient monument was built by mysterious super geniuses with impossible tools and excellent posture. Nothing quite so theatrical. More in the sense that the story we inherited may be far tidier than the real one ever was. Before we get into that though, I'd love to know where you're listening from. What part of the world are you in right now? Is it late where you are, or early? Are you under a blanket, on a train, in bed, at a desk, pretending to do something responsible, while actually listening to a soothing video about history, collapsing into uncertainty? Whatever the case, I'm very glad you're here. And if this kind of slow, curious wandering through the world helps you relax, think, or simply breathe a little easier at the end of the day, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this calm little project find its way to other people who may also enjoy a gentler approach to the very large and occasionally unsettling questions. Now, with that said, let's make ourselves comfortable inside one of the biggest assumptions most of us carry without noticing. The assumption that the human past is mostly settled, that the broad outline is known, that we may still argue about a date here, a king there, a migration route, a missing tomb, a battle, a dynasty, but that the overall shape of the story is secure. First came simple hunter-gatherers, then agriculture, then villages, then cities, then writing, then states, empires, religion, law, war, trade, and all the familiar business of civilization. A clean line, a sensible progression, a staircase rising from caves to skyscrapers, with a few unfortunate collapses along the way, and a lot more sandals than anyone asked for. It is a very satisfying story. That should make us a little suspicious of it right away. Human beings adore a neat narrative. We like beginnings, middles, and ends. We like causes that lead to effects, and effects that can be traced back to sensible causes. We like eras with names. We like maps with arrows. We like timelines laid out like train schedules, as if the past were a well-run station and not a loud, messy crowd of people losing tools, changing languages, moving rivers, forgetting things, burying things, stealing things, worshipping things, and leaving behind broken pottery for future scholars to argue over with terrifying enthusiasm. The truth is, history is not the past itself. History is our reconstruction of the past, and that reconstruction is based on fragments, bones, ruins, seeds, charcoal, inscriptions, oral traditions, genetic traces, a handful of bodies preserved by accident, garbage pits, which, to be fair, have turned out to be one of humanity's most honest archives. A great deal of what we know comes not from complete records, but from partial evidence assembled by people doing their best. Very intelligent best, often admirable best, sometimes deeply biased best, but still best. And when new evidence appears, the story changes. That part is normal. In fact, it is healthy. It is how knowledge works. But something interesting happens when the subject is human history. We tend to resist those changes more than we resist changes in, say, astronomy or geology. If scientists announce that a star is older than we thought, most people manage to survive the news. If archaeologists suggest that an old timeline may be seriously off, or that a culture we dismissed as simple was anything but, people become strangely tense. Perhaps because history is personal. It is where nations get their myths. It is where institutions get their authority. It is where religions, identities, schools, empires and family stories build their roots. To say the story may be wrong is not just to rearrange dates, it is to disturb a house many people thought was built on stone, and yet that disturbance keeps happening. Again and again, archaeologists uncover something inconvenient, a site older than expected, a trade network far wider than assumed, evidence of symbolic behaviour in people once described as primitive, complex architecture in places where no one thought complexity should exist, genetic mixing between human groups that were once treated like separate clean categories, ancient diets that do not match the picture in our heads, writing systems that appear earlier, or social organisation that appears without writing at all. Every few years the past does something mildly impolite and refuses to stay where we put it. What's especially fascinating is not that scholars get things wrong. Of course they do. Everyone does. What matters is the pattern of the wrongness. Over and over, we underestimate the sophistication, adaptability, and diversity of earlier humans. We assume things emerged once, in one place, in one clear order, and then spread outward like a lesson plan. We imagine progress as linear because that is easy to teach and easy to remember, but the archaeological record increasingly suggests something less tidy. Human societies seem to have experimented far more than we once believed. They tried different forms of living together. They built, abandoned, rebuilt, migrated, exchanged ideas, borrowed technologies, forgot techniques, rediscovered them, and sometimes managed levels of coordination that do not fit the old script at all. That matters because the old script quietly shapes how we think about ourselves. If history is a straight ladder, then the people at the top of the current rung get to feel inevitable. They get to feel advanced in a very self-congratulatory way. They can point backward and say, there we were, simple and rough, and here we are, refined and correct, with indoor plumbing and extremely persuasive presentation software. But if the human past is not a ladder, if it is more like a braided river of experiments, collapses, inventions, accidents and recoveries, then the present looks less like destiny and more like one current arrangement among many. That is a humbling thought. Also, frankly, a useful one. Think about how most of us first meet history. Usually in school, often through national narratives, simplified maps, and bold statements delivered with tremendous confidence. Civilization began here. Agriculture started there. These people discovered this. Those people conquered that. This empire rose. That empire fell. It is not that these lessons are useless. They are necessary introductions, but they also create a false sense of solidity. They hide the uncertainty beneath the surface. They do not always mention how much is disputed, how much is inferred, or how much of the timeline has been revised repeatedly over the last few decades. They also tend to focus on the kinds of evidence that survive well, and the kinds of societies that resemble the institutions we recognise. States leave monuments, empires leave inscriptions, bureaucracies leave records, palaces leave rubble in impressively large quantities, but plenty of human sophistication leaves quieter traces. A society can be highly organised without massive stone architecture. It can be intellectually rich without writing. It can understand landscapes, plants, water systems, astronomy, or social cooperation at a very high level without producing the sort of evidence that an early 20th century historian would immediately rank as civilization. In other words, the past may have been full of intelligence we trained ourselves not to see. And then there is the issue of survival. The record is not fair. The past has not been preserved evenly. Forests swallow wood. Oceans erase coasts. Floodplains bury settlements. Ice protects some bodies, while heat destroys others. Entire chapters of human life may be gone simply because the materials were fragile, the climate was unhelpful, or a later city decided that an older temple would make excellent building stone. What survives is not always what mattered most. It is simply what endured. That is a very different thing. Imagine trying to reconstruct our current civilization from a few parking lots, some broken ceramics, 5 receipts, a buried sewer line, and the remains of one shopping centre. You might conclude that we worshipped escalators and ate an alarming amount of processed cheese, which in fairness would not be entirely wrong, but it would not capture the full richness of modern life. Future scholars might spend decades arguing about the ritual significance of food courts. They might misread a slogan as a religious statement. They might decide that one surviving luxury district represented everyone. The point is not to mock archaeology, quite the opposite. The point is to appreciate how difficult the task is. Reconstructing the deep past from fragments is a little like assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle after half the pieces have been burned, several belong to another box, and someone in the next room keeps announcing that they already know what the picture is supposed to be. So when we say that everything we thought about human history may be wrong, we do not necessarily mean that every date, every culture, every accepted conclusion must be thrown dramatically out the window while a violin plays. What we mean is that the framework may be shakier than we were taught. The categories may be too rigid, the timeline may be too clean, the assumptions may be too modern, the confidence may be too high, and some of those assumptions are surprisingly recent. For a long time, scholars were inclined to picture prehistory in a rather patronising way. Small groups wandering about in a haze of necessity, reacting to nature, slowly stumbling into farming, then finally graduating into proper civilization once they had cities, kings, walls, taxes, and the administrative joy of counting grain. But discoveries from many parts of the world have complicated that picture enormously. We now see evidence of large gatherings before agriculture, monumental construction before settled urban life in the familiar sense, long-distance exchange far earlier than expected, and social complexity appearing in forms that do not fit the old textbook sequence very well at all. That does not mean there was a lost global super-civilization with matching stone-cutting contracts on every continent. It means human beings were capable of a broader range of organised behaviour than we once allowed. It means that our ancestors were not waiting passively for history to begin. They were already making it, even in periods older scholarship treated as little more than a prologue. There is also the uncomfortable fact that history has often been written by people with strong reasons to simplify it. Colonial powers simplified the past of the peoples they conquered. Nationalist movements simplified the past to produce cleaner origin stories. Religious traditions simplified the past to fit sacred chronology. Even modern academia, for all its careful methods, has sometimes inherited frameworks built under older political assumptions. Once a narrative gets institutional support, it becomes very sticky. It appears in museums, classrooms, documentaries, encyclopedias, and public memory. Challenging it requires more than new evidence. It requires changing habits of thought. That is slower work. This is why the history of history can be almost as revealing as history itself. If you look closely, you begin to notice that every era reconstructs the past in its own image. Victorians found progress everywhere because they believed in progress. Early national historians discovered ancient nations because they were busy building modern ones. 20th century scholars often emphasized hierarchy, administration, and central control because those looked like serious forms of civilization to them. More recent work has become better at noticing networks, ecology, mobility, cooperation, gender, exchange, and local adaptation. The evidence changes, yes, but so do the questions. And the questions we ask determine a great deal about what we are able to see. So perhaps the deeper issue is not merely that the old answers may be wrong. It is that we may have been asking the wrong questions in the first place. Not, when did civilization begin, as if there were a starting pistol and a neat finish line, but how many different ways have humans learned to live together? Not who first became advanced, but what do we even mean by advanced? Not, why did simple people become complex, but why were we ever so sure they were simple? Once that door opens, the atmosphere changes. The past becomes less like a museum hallway and more like a landscape in fog. Shapes emerge, disappear, return in altered form, Old certainties look less certain. Small finds matter. Gaps matter. Silence matters. And we begin to understand that history is not a completed portrait hanging on the wall. It is an ongoing investigation conducted by a species that is trying, with mixed success and occasional arrogance, to remember itself. There is something rather moving about that, I think. Human beings are the sort of creatures who bury their dead, tell stories about their ancestors, carve symbols into stone, write records, lose records, burn libraries, rebuild libraries, misread ruins, return to ruins, and keep asking where we came from. We want a stable story because uncertainty is tiring. But uncertainty may be the truest part of the whole enterprise. The past is not obligated to be clear. It is not obligated to flatter us. It is not obligated to support the comforting tale that everything unfolded in a sensible order, leading by remarkable good fortune to us. And perhaps that is where tonight's journey really begins, not with a conspiracy, and not with a dramatic declaration that all historians have been asleep at the wheel, though a few of them may have dozed off in archives after lunch, which seems only fair. It begins with a quieter realization. The story of humanity may be older, stranger, more tangled, and more inventive than the standard version suggests. Pieces may be missing, other pieces may be in the wrong place, some may have been misidentified entirely. And when we start to look carefully, the ground beneath familiar timelines begins to shift just a little. So let's keep moving gently into that uncertainty. Let's take the old picture off the wall, set it down on the table, and have a closer look at the cracks. Because once you begin to notice how the accepted story was built, and how often it has been rebuilt, it becomes much easier to ask a very simple question that turns out to be surprisingly powerful. What exactly is the story we thought we knew in the first place? So what is the story we thought we knew? If we're going to question the familiar version of human history, it seems only fair to begin by laying that version out on the table properly. Like an old map that has been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases now look more confident than the actual borders. Because for most of us, the standard account of the human past arrives long before we ever realise it is an account at all. It comes packaged as common knowledge. It sits in school books, museum captions, television documentaries, and those wonderfully authoritative diagrams where arrows move across continents as if millions of people had the courtesy to migrate in neat educational lines. It feels settled, sensible, respectably arranged. And because it feels that way, we rarely stop to ask who arranged it, what evidence it rests on, what assumptions it carries, and how many rough edges were quietly sanded off to make it fit inside a few dozen lessons before lunch. The familiar version usually begins with a very simple picture. For most of human existence, the story says, we lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers. We moved around. We followed animals, seasons, water, and wild plants. Life was hard, uncertain, and generally lacking in storage space. Then, somewhere around 12,000 years ago, in a few important places, everything began to change. Humans discovered agriculture. We settled down. Villages appeared. Food surpluses grew. Population increased. Work became specialized. Pottery improved. Someone began counting grain. Someone else became important enough to own more than one chair. Then came cities, rulers, priests, walls, writing, law, taxation, warfare on a grander scale, and the great official entrance of civilization. If this version were a school play, farming would be the star, cities the dramatic second act, and writing the moment everyone in the audience sits up and says, "Ah, yes, now history has truly started." There is a reason this story has endured. It is neat. It is teachable. It gives us a sequence. First this, then that. It lets us move from caves to kingdoms in an orderly fashion. And perhaps most importantly, it flatters our love of progress. It suggests that humanity advanced step by step from simplicity to complexity, from survival to society, from rough stone tools to grand architecture and bureaucratic inconvenience. The whole thing has the shape of a ladder. At the bottom, foragers. Above them, farmers. Then city dwellers. Then empires. Then classical civilizations. Then eventually, after a tremendous amount of conquest, plagues, paperwork, and deeply regrettable hairstyles, us. That ladder is not entirely invented. Real changes did happen. Agriculture did transform human life in many parts of the world. Cities did emerge. Writing did appear and radically alter what could be recorded, administered, and remembered. States did consolidate power. Empires did expand. No serious person is claiming that none of this occurred. The problem is not that the old story contains no truth. The problem is that it often treats one path as the path, one sequence as the sequence, and one definition of sophistication as the only one that matters. The more you look at it, the more it starts to resemble a summary written by someone in a hurry, with a strong preference for kings, walls, and written records. Think of how often the standard story places enormous weight on a few famous locations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. These are presented as cradles of civilization, and reasonably so because they do give us early cities, monumental building, organised states, and, in several cases, writing systems. But the way the story is often told can create the impression that real history happened mainly in such places, while the rest of humanity stood around in varying degrees of prelude, waiting for complexity to arrive with proper documentation. It can make the deep past sound as though it were divided between people who matter to history and people who were simply near it. That is one of the oldest habits in historical storytelling, and one of the hardest to shake. Written records have always had prestige. If a society left texts, inscriptions, laws, letters, ledgers, annals, royal boasts, temple accounts, tax lists, or dramatic warnings from irritated officials, historians have something visible to hold. Writing gives names, dates, voices, structures, and arguments. It tells us who claimed power and what they wanted remembered. It also gives future scholars a kind of comforting grip. Once words appear, the past feels less slippery. You can quote it. You can file it. You can fight over translation in seminar rooms. All very civilized. But this creates an obvious bias. A society without writing may be treated as less historical, not because it lacked memory, knowledge, or social organisation, but because its records were carried differently, in oral traditions, landscapes, craft practices, ritual, and collective habit rather than in ink and clay. And so, the conventional story often draws a quiet line between prehistory and history, as if writing were the gatekeeper to importance. Before writing, shadowy humanity. After writing, proper people with archives. This is useful in one limited sense. It helps classify evidence, but it also encourages a distorted view of the human past. It suggests that what cannot speak in writing cannot speak clearly at all, which is a bit like deciding that music does not count as music unless someone wrote the sheet properly and filed it in triplicate. Another familiar feature of the standard story is how confidently it links complexity with hierarchy. We are taught, directly or indirectly, that once societies grow, they naturally become more stratified, more centralized, more state-like. Agriculture leads to surplus, surplus leads to elites, elites lead to administration, and administration leads to civilization. In this view, complexity tends to mean layers of command. Kings, priests, officials, soldiers, record keepers, labourers, and the unfortunate person who somehow ended up responsible for moving 20 tons of stone uphill in summer. The implication is that large, organised societies require top-down control, and that monumental achievements are proof of rigid authority. If something impressive was built, the assumption goes, there must have been a ruler with a plan, a hierarchy with enforcement, and quite possibly a workforce that would rather have been elsewhere. Again, sometimes that is true, but the conventional version tends to treat it as almost automatic. It leaves little room for the idea that human beings may have organised themselves in many different ways, at different scales, and at different times. It also tends to imagine permanent forms where there may have been seasonal ones, flexible ones, or arrangements that changed according to circumstance. In other words, it treats social order as if it always hardens in the same direction, from loose to rigid, from equal to unequal, from wandering to settled, from local to centralised. The human past begins to look less like a field of experiments and more like a conveyor belt. Then there is the matter of farming, which in the old story plays a role so decisive that it starts to resemble a miracle cure, a tragedy, and a management seminar all at once. Agriculture is often portrayed as the turning point that made everything else possible. Settle down, plant crops, store grain, raise animals, and civilization follows. This version contains truth, but it can also be too abrupt. It gives the impression that once humans discovered farming, the decision was so obviously superior that everyone sensible would adopt it and move smoothly into village life. Yet the archaeological picture suggests something less straightforward. Farming was not necessarily better for everyone in every way. Early agricultural lives could be harsher in terms of nutrition, disease exposure, labour intensity, and vulnerability to crop failure. Plenty of people continued mixed ways of life for long periods. Some adopted farming gradually. Some combined cultivation with hunting, gathering, herding, fishing, or seasonal movement. Some likely looked at the whole business of digging and weeding and thought, very politely, no thank you. But the textbook version has little patience for that kind of messiness. It wants a pivot. It wants a before and after. It wants hunter-gatherers to pass the torch to farmers, who pass it to city builders, who pass it to dynasties, who pass it to empires, all with the smooth efficiency of a relay race no actual human civilization has ever managed. This is partly because clean sequences are easier to teach. It is also because modern societies are very attached to certain benchmarks: settled life, food production, urban growth, bureaucracy, metalworking, writing, law. We recognise ourselves more easily in those features, so we treat them as milestones of arrival. And then comes the geography of prestige. The usual story gives special status to certain centres of origin. Civilization begins in river valleys. Knowledge radiates outward. Innovations emerge in a few core zones and spread to others. Diffusion becomes the dominant pattern. This framework has real value, since ideas, crops, technologies, and practices absolutely do spread across regions. Yet when overused, it makes peripheral societies appear passive, as if history happens somewhere else first and they simply receive it later. It underestimates independent invention, local adaptation, and the possibility that many regions developed complexity on their own terms rather than merely waiting for the civilized signal to arrive. It is also worth noticing how often the conventional picture was shaped by the eras that told it. 19th century scholars, especially in Europe, loved developmental stages. They liked ranking societies. They liked systems. They liked progress charts. They had empires, industrial cities, museums full of imported artifacts, and a fairly strong conviction that history culminated in people suspiciously like themselves. Unsurprisingly, many of them arranged the human past in a manner that made modern European state society look like the advanced outcome of a long universal process. This did not always happen through bad faith. Often it happened through assumptions so ordinary they seemed invisible. Of course cities are more advanced than mobile societies. Of course writing marks a higher stage. Of course centralised states are the mature form of political life. Of course large monuments imply strong rulers. Of course the people currently classifying the world occupy the latest and most developed rung. It was all terribly convenient. Colonialism also left fingerprints all over historical interpretation. When imperial powers encountered societies with different political structures, land practices or record systems, they often described them as backward, stalled, or incomplete. This was useful, morally and administratively. If conquered peoples could be framed as living remnants of humanity's earlier stages, empire could pose as instruction rather than domination. Their land could be reclassified, their institutions could be dismissed, their history could be reduced. Even archaeology was not immune to this. Ancient achievements in colonized regions were sometimes attributed to outsiders, vanished races, or civilizing intrusions because the idea that local ancestors had built them did not sit comfortably with the prejudices of the day. Humanity's past was not merely studied, it was arranged to support power. Schoolbooks inherited a great deal of that structure. Not always the cruder racism, though sometimes that too lingered shamefully long, but certainly the narrative shape. Civilizations rose in proper sequence. Complexity marched forward. The state became the normal destination of political life. Europe inherited classical antiquity, carried the torch through modernity, and so on. Even when newer scholarship corrected particular errors, the skeleton often remained. We still tell the story with beginnings and milestones that feel suspiciously tailored to the institutions we already value. There is also a psychological comfort in the old version. It makes the past understandable. It tells us where we came from in broad, coherent terms. It gives us ancestors with jobs we can recognise and a timeline we can memorise. More than that, it reassures us that the present emerged through a rational sequence. We are where we are because history advanced. Complex societies replaced simple ones. Better tools replaced worse ones. Record-keeping replaced forgetfulness. Science replaced superstition. At each step, the world became more organised, more informed, more capable. This story is not wholly false, but it is selective. It tends to keep the parts that flatter modernity and lose the parts that complicate it. For example, the standard narrative often speaks as though human communities began small and egalitarian, then became large and unequal as complexity increased. Yet the archaeological and anthropological picture suggests that humans may have moved between arrangements more fluidly than that. People are quite capable of inventing hierarchy, dismantling it, performing it seasonally, parodying it, ritualizing it, and then doing something else entirely. We are a very inventive species, especially when it comes to deciding who gets to tell everyone else where to sit. The older narrative underestimated this flexibility because it preferred stable categories: tribe, chiefdom, state, simple, intermediate, advanced. Useful labels, perhaps, but labels have a way of acting like cages once they are printed often enough. Museums helped reinforce the sense of order. Walk through many traditional galleries and you move from stone tools to pottery, to bronze, to urban civilization, as though humanity had agreed on a single curriculum. Cases aligned with objects from distinct times and places, yet the arrangement encourages a general impression of upward progression. This is not entirely the museum's fault. Exhibitions need structure, but structure shapes memory. People leave with the feeling that the human past developed in one grand ascent. The result is a very polished illusion. Orderly eras, clear transitions, recognisable achievements, and just enough uncertainty to seem scholarly without threatening the overall plot. What makes all of this especially important is that the old story does not merely organise the past. It organises our expectations. It tells us what to look for when we excavate. It tells us what counts as evidence of significance. It tells us which questions seem reasonable. If you believe civilization begins with cities, then a large ceremonial gathering place used by mobile populations looks odd but not central. If you believe hierarchy is required for complexity, then evidence of large-scale cooperation without obvious kings may be treated as puzzling rather than foundational. If you assume progress is linear, then societies that do not fit the ladder look like exceptions instead of clues. In other words, the story we thought we knew has not just described evidence. It has helped decide in advance what evidence means. And yet, despite all its power, the standard picture keeps running into trouble. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more they find behaviour that does not sit comfortably in the old sequence. Monumental construction turns up before the expected social conditions. Trade networks appear broader and earlier than predicted. Human groups once treated as marginal display enormous ecological knowledge and social sophistication. Settlements emerge, vanish, and reappear in patterns that do not look like simple forward progression. Some societies develop striking complexity without the institutions the textbook model would have insisted upon. Others adopt agriculture only partly. Others reject centralization. Others leave built environments so large and elaborate that the old categories begin sweating through their collars. That is why it matters to understand the conventional story clearly, not so we can sneer at it, and not so we can replace it with fantasy, but so we can see exactly what is being challenged. The old model says that human history was a mostly linear journey, from foraging bands to farming villages to cities and states, driven by material necessity and technological advance, culminating in increasingly complex hierarchical societies whose importance can largely be tracked through monuments and writing. It says civilization began in a few centres and spread. It says complexity requires certain structures. It says prehistory was mainly preparation. It says the broad outline is known. But once you say it plainly like that, something in it starts to feel a little too smooth. Real human beings are not known for behaving in ways that make future timelines easy to print. We improvise, we adopt half solutions, we cling to old habits, we borrow ideas and repurpose them. We build things for reasons that make perfect sense at the time and almost none 3,000 years later. We form social arrangements that are practical, symbolic, seasonal, accidental, and occasionally absurd. We do not march neatly toward a destination. We make a mess, then a pattern, then another mess. So perhaps the most useful thing we can do now is hold the accepted story in our minds without giving it complete trust. We can treat it as a model, not a verdict. A powerful summary, but still a summary. Because once the familiar outline is in view, the next question becomes impossible to avoid. If this tidy account was built by privileging certain kinds of evidence, certain forms of society, and certain assumptions about progress, then what happens when we look further back, before civilization supposedly had its official beginning, and ask whether the people waiting there were ever really waiting at all? If we go back before the point where textbooks usually begin speaking with confidence, before the first kings with names we can pronounce badly, before the tax records, the dynasties, the city walls, and the satisfying appearance of dates that make historians feel slightly more secure, we find ourselves in a stretch of human life that used to be treated as background. The waiting room, essentially. A long preface populated by small groups of foragers, moving through forests and grasslands, following animal herds, gathering roots and berries, making tools, making fires, raising children, burying their dead, and supposedly doing very little else until agriculture came along and history finally put on a tie. That was the old impression. Useful for summarizing perhaps, but not especially respectful. It made the deep human past sound like a long, dim hallway leading to the real event. Civilization had not yet arrived, so apparently no one had thought to be interesting. But the more carefully we look at these earlier people, the less that picture holds together. Because long before civilization had a name, humans were already doing many of the things that, in hindsight, look very much like the early stages of it. They were organizing, planning, remembering, building, exchanging, adapting, and above all, experimenting with ways to live. One reason the older picture lasted so long is that mobile societies are easy to underestimate. If a people do not leave behind large cities, huge walls, royal tombs, or libraries full of official complaints, later societies tend to imagine them as simple. We confuse portability with primitiveness. We mistake the absence of stone monuments for the absence of structure. But that is a modern bias, and not a very flattering one. It assumes that complexity must be heavy, permanent and bureaucratic to count. It assumes that unless a society leaves behind something archaeologists can trip over in impressive quantities, it was merely surviving. Yet mobile human groups had to know landscapes with extraordinary precision. They had to track seasons, migration routes, water sources, edible plants, dangerous plants, animal habits, weather patterns, and social relationships across space and time. They had to remember where things were, when things happened, who was connected to whom, which places were safe, which places were sacred, and how to move through a changing world without starving, freezing, or offending the wrong neighbouring group. That is not the work of dull people drifting through an empty age. That is the work of highly capable communities operating in environments they understood far better than most of us understand the route to our nearest grocery store. For a very long time, the standard story treated hunter-gatherers as if they lived in tiny bands, isolated and constantly on the edge of survival, with social worlds too small and unstable to produce much of lasting consequence. That picture now looks much too narrow. Some foraging societies were indeed small and mobile. Others gathered seasonally in large numbers. Some built substantial structures. Some managed landscapes through fire and deliberate ecological intervention. Some maintained long-distance exchange networks. Some developed ritual traditions, symbolic systems, and artistic practices that require planning, teaching, memory, and continuity over generations. And once you admit that, a rather awkward question appears. If people who had not yet become farmers could still organise large gatherings, share complex knowledge, and create enduring cultural worlds, then what exactly were they missing that made us so eager to call them pre-civilised in the first place? The answer, for a long time, was agriculture. Farming became the great dividing line, the event that supposedly transformed humanity from adaptable wanderers into serious historical actors. But even here, the earlier world looks less passive than the old model allowed. People did not wake up one morning, discover wheat, and immediately become urban planners. The transition was long, uneven, local, and in many places reversible. Human groups were interacting with plants and animals for thousands of years in increasingly deliberate ways before full agriculture took hold. They were observing growth cycles, harvesting strategically, altering landscapes, storing food, and perhaps in some cases encouraging the presence of useful species well before the neat textbook moment when farming officially begins. The boundary between foraging and farming is not always a clean one. It can blur into management, cultivation, tending, seasonal settlement, or mixed strategies that do not fit the sharp categories later historians preferred. What is striking is how much of human ingenuity was already present before that boundary hardened. Consider social memory alone. To survive without written records in changing environments requires an astonishing ability to transmit knowledge. Roots, seasons, kinship ties, tool-making skills, medicinal practices, stories attached to places, warnings, agreements, ritual obligations and practical techniques all have to be taught and retained. Oral culture is often spoken of as though it was somehow less reliable than written culture, as if writing is memory and speech is merely performance. But oral societies can preserve vast amounts of information through repetition, rhythm, story structure, ceremony, and social reinforcement. In some cases, they may remember what literate societies are very good at forgetting. How deeply practical knowledge and identity are tied to place. A map written in a notebook is useful. A map embedded in the habits, stories, and shared movement of a people is something else entirely. And then there is the matter of building. The old story assumes that monumental or semi-monumental construction belongs to settled, agricultural, hierarchical life. First the crops, then the village, then the temple, then the king begins taking credit for things. But the archaeological record has become much less cooperative with that neat order. We now know that people before the classic urban era could gather labour, shape stone, arrange ceremonial space, and create places of repeated importance without fitting easily into the later category of city-based civilization. That matters a great deal. It suggests that the ability to coordinate many people around shared goals did not suddenly appear after farming reached a certain level. It was already there in some form, waiting to be recognised. One of the reasons this is so important is that it changes the direction of explanation. For generations, scholars assumed that once food surplus existed, hierarchy and ritual complexity would follow. But some sites hint that shared ritual, symbolic activity, and communal construction may have helped draw people together before large-scale settle farming fully matured. In other words, instead of agriculture simply causing social complexity, it may be that social complexity in some places helped create the conditions in which agriculture became attractive, manageable, or necessary. That does not overturn everything, but it does scramble the sequence quite nicely. It means people were not just reacting to economic pressure, they may also have been gathering for reasons of identity, ceremony, obligation, prestige, memory, or cooperation, and then reorganising life around those activities. Human beings, it turns out, have rarely needed only one reason to do anything. This is also where the deep past begins to look less like a ladder and more like a field of prototypes. Different groups in different regions appear to have tried different arrangements. Some remained highly mobile, some became seasonally settled, some built significant sites without becoming classic urban states. Some developed agriculture without immediately becoming centralised. Some combined older and newer ways of life for centuries. The idea that humanity as a whole marched in a single sequence from wild to settled to civilised becomes harder to defend once you can see so many local variations. It is more accurate and more interesting to imagine long stretches of experimentation. People tested ways of living. Some worked for a time, some collapsed, some changed shape, some left traces too faint for us to understand fully. That may sound less tidy than the schoolbook model, but it sounds much more like actual humans. There is also a chronological arrogance built into the older story. We tend to assume that because earlier people came before us, they must also have been less capable in broad intellectual terms. Their tools may have been simpler in material form, yes. Their social institutions may not map neatly onto ours, also yes. But this does not mean they were mentally or culturally undeveloped. By the time we reach the later Ice Age and the periods just after it, human beings are already fully human in the cognitive sense that matters most. They make art, ornaments, composite tools, structured burials, and objects with symbolic significance. They adapt to extreme climates, cross difficult landscapes, use fire strategically, exploit varied food sources, and maintain social networks over large areas. They are not waiting for intelligence to arrive. Intelligence is already there, busy finding solutions with the materials at hand. If anything, the real difference between these earlier worlds and later civilizations may lie less in basic human capability than in density, scale, storage, and institutional persistence. A mobile group can be extraordinarily sophisticated and still not produce the same archaeological footprint as a dense farming society with permanent buildings. But footprint is not the same thing as importance. The danger comes when we read the scale of surviving ruins as a direct measure of human worth or social complexity. A city is easy to admire because it remains in one place. A mobile society may pass across a landscape for centuries, shaping it deeply, and leave much less for a tourist brochure. That tells us more about preservation than about achievement. The environment, of course, plays a huge role in all this. Before civilization had a formal name, humans were living through major climatic fluctuations, especially around the end of the last ice age. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, coastlines shifted, ecosystems changed, animals moved or vanished. Some landscapes became more hospitable, others less. What that means is that many human communities were not merely drifting through stable settings waiting for progress to happen. They were responding to enormous environmental change with flexibility, creativity, and resilience. They had to rethink routes, resources, and seasonal strategies. They had to revise inherited knowledge. They had to innovate without the luxury of believing that the world was done changing. in that respect, they may have been living through something more challenging than the calm progression implied by older historical models. Rising sea levels are especially important here, because so much early human life likely took place along coasts, river mouths, and productive shorelines that are now underwater. That means some of the most attractive and resource-rich zones for early settlement, gathering and exchange have been drowned by post-glacial sea rise. We are missing part of the story not because nothing happened there, but because the places where it happened now lie beneath the sea, where excavation is harder and certainty is expensive. When we say the early human record is incomplete, this is one of the clearest reasons why. Entire landscapes of significance may be gone from easy reach. It is a little difficult to build a perfect history when some of the pages are at the bottom of the ocean, and even on land the record is selective. Organic materials decay, wood disappears, fibres vanish. Temporary architecture leaves subtle traces. A society can know exactly what it is doing and still leave almost nothing obvious behind after enough centuries of erosion, flood, vegetation, and reuse. This means that the deep past is biased towards stone, bone, charcoal, and things lucky enough to survive. Imagine judging a modern society only by its parking garages, glass shards, and the remains of one metal warehouse. You might conclude that we were devoted to rectangles and mild despair. You would not be entirely wrong, but you would miss quite a lot. What becomes clear, once we sit with this earlier period for a while, is that the phrase "before civilization had a name" says more about later naming habits than about the people themselves. We have a tendency to define eras by what later institutions can recognise. No cities yet, no state yet, no writing yet, no formal administration yet. But living people do not experience their own lives as not yet. They live in a complete present. They have kin, obligations, fears, practical tasks, sacred places, remembered ancestors, preferred foods, jokes, rules, rivalries, and routines. They are not incomplete versions of us. They are themselves. It sounds obvious, and yet history has often failed to treat ancient people with that basic fairness. We cast them as preparation rather than participants. The same problem appears in the language of emergence. We love to say that something emerged as if it had not existed in any relevant form before the moment it became visible to us. Religion emerged. Social hierarchy emerged. Long-distance trade emerged. Monumental construction emerged. But often what really happened is that a practice crossed a threshold of visibility in the surviving record. Its roots may be much older. The habits, beliefs, and organisational capacities behind it may already have been present, developing quietly or unevenly for generations. The archaeological record is full of thresholds like that. A thing seems to appear suddenly because the evidence becomes unmistakable, not because human beings invented it overnight on a Tuesday and immediately got to work. This matters especially when we think about large communal sites in the earlier world. If people could come together repeatedly, contribute labour, shape landscapes, and maintain symbolic spaces without fitting neatly into the classic model of city-state civilization, then the line between pre-civilized and civilized begins to look suspiciously administrative. It suggests that what later scholars called civilization may be just one cluster of highly visible outcomes, among a much wider range of human social possibilities. Some of those possibilities led towards cities and writing, others may not have, but that does not make them lesser, only less familiar. It is also possible that some earlier social forms were more flexible than later civilizations, not less. Dense states are powerful, but they are also brittle in their own way. They rely on concentrated food systems, political control, social hierarchy, and often substantial coercion. Mobile or semi-mobile communities, by contrast, may be able to adjust more quickly to environmental change, move away from local failure, or reorganize social life with fewer fixed institutions to defend. This does not make one form better in every case. It simply reminds us that history is not a single contest with one obvious winner. Agriculture, cities and states solved some problems and created many others. They allowed scale, storage, and monumental continuity. They also brought disease, inequality, labour intensification, and bureaucratic unpleasantness on a scale no foraging band could have imagined. Every system comes with invoices. This is another reason the old story was too clean. It presented civilization as a clear upgrade. But if you were a person living through one of those transitions, the advantages might not always feel immediate. Settled life could mean harder work. Crop dependence could mean new vulnerabilities. Permanent villages could concentrate waste and illness. Hierarchies could become more rigid, and while prestige goods and ceremonial centres may impress us now, they did not necessarily guarantee comfort to the average person, hauling things around on behalf of communal greatness. The movement towards civilization, if we insist on that term, was not simply a rise. It was a trade, sometimes a costly one. Yet despite all this, the standard narrative kept acting as though the earlier world existed mainly to lead into the later one. That is what changes once we take the pre-urban past seriously on its own terms. We begin to see that many of the ingredients usually associated with civilization were already present in partial, shifting, or local forms before the package had a label. Social coordination, symbolic life, ecological management, memory systems, exchange networks, communal gathering, territorial understanding, craftsmanship, and adaptation to changing environments were all part of human life long before the first city officials began inventing taxes and calling it progress. Civilization did not arrive in a vacuum. It condensed out of capacities that had been developing for a very long time, and once you accept that, the timeline starts to feel less like a neat staircase and more like a broad plain with many paths crossing it. Some lead toward settled farming villages. Some lead toward seasonal ceremonial centres. Some toward mobile resilience. Some vanish into wetlands, coastlines, and buried landscapes we may never fully recover. The people living there were not standing outside history. They were making choices within conditions we only partly understand. They were not nameless because they lacked identities. They are nameless mostly because their names did not survive in forms we can read. There is a difference, and it is an important one. So when we say before civilization had a name, we should probably hear it as a warning against our own categories. We are looking at a time before later historians had decided what counted as a beginning. That is not the same as looking at a time before real human complexity. In fact, the deeper we look, the harder it becomes to maintain the old confidence that civilization appeared only after a long, simple prelude. The prelude was already crowded with intelligence, adaptation, cooperation, and social invention, and once that much is admitted, the next problem arrives almost immediately. Because if people were already far more organised and capable than the standard timeline once allowed, then those places we call the first cities may not have been first in quite the way we were taught. That is the problem with the phrase first city. It sounds precise, almost official, as though somewhere in the human past a clerk rang a bell, stamped a tablet, and announced that after a long trial period of villages, campfires, and awkward experiments with grain, the city had now been invented. But archaeology is rarely so obliging. The more closely scholars study early urban life, the more they admit that the category itself is slippery. Recent work in the archaeology of early cities emphasises that pre-modern urbanisation was far more diverse than older models assumed, and that what counts as a city depends very much on what qualities we prioritise: population size, density, institutions, monumental space, economic specialisation, persistence, or social networks. In other words, the question is not simply which city came first, but first according to which definition. For a long time, the most comfortable answer was Uruk. And to be fair, Uruk has an excellent case. By around 3200 BCE, it was enormous by the standards of the ancient world, politically important, architecturally impressive, and closely linked with the development of early writing and administrative systems. If you want a place that looks unmistakably urban in the familiar sense, with monumental buildings and all the signs that later civilizations would recognise with a pleased nod. Uruk fits beautifully. It is often described as the first true city not because no one before it had settled, gathered, built or organised, but because by then a number of urban features had become concentrated in one place at one scale. That is a meaningful distinction, though not quite the same thing as saying nothing city-like existed before. Once you notice that distinction, the ground begins to shift, because there were already places before Uruk that were large, permanent, socially coordinated, and in some cases monumental. Jericho, or Tel es Sultan, is one of the most famous examples. UNESCO describes Neolithic Jericho as already a sizable permanent settlement by the 9th to 8th millennium BCE, with surviving monumental features including a wall, a ditch and a tower. That is astonishingly early. It does not look like a fully developed Mesopotamian city-state, of course, and no one sensible should pretend otherwise. But it does look uncomfortably advanced for a place we are meant to file away under before the first cities. A permanent settlement with substantial communal construction forces us to ask whether our old timeline has been too eager to reserve seriousness for later urban forms. Then there is Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey, another site that has caused generations of tidy narratives to clear their throats uneasily. UNESCO describes it as a rare and exceptionally well-preserved Neolithic settlement, notable for its large size, long occupation, back-to-back houses with roof access, and rich symbolic life, including wall paintings and reliefs. It flourished thousands of years before the classic city model of Mesopotamia. Was it a city in the strict later sense? Many scholars hesitate. Was it a large, dense, highly organised settlement with a sophisticated social and symbolic world? Absolutely. And that matters, because if a place can be large, permanent, densely inhabited, architecturally unusual, and culturally rich without fitting our preferred urban template, then perhaps the template is the thing that needs correcting. This is where the older historical story begins to show its habits. It liked firsts very much. The first city, the first state, the first civilization, the first writing, the first proper example of people finally behaving in a way that leads to a neat timeline. But human beings are rarely kind enough to innovate one thing at a time and label it clearly for posterity. Settlement density, ritual elaboration, food production, social differentiation, exchange networks, symbolic systems, and administrative practices do not always arrive together like a coordinated delivery service. Sometimes one comes early and another lags. Sometimes a community builds large and complex spaces without obvious kings. Sometimes people live densely without monumental palaces. Sometimes they gather seasonally rather than permanently. Sometimes they are more settled than their tools imply, or more mobile than their buildings suggest. The pathway to urbanism, if we even want to keep using that singular noun, appears to have been far less orderly than the ladder in the textbook. Part of the problem lies in the word city itself. To us, it often means a place with streets, districts, political institutions, social classes, craft specialization, storage systems, and enough people to make losing your sandals statistically inevitable. But early settlements do not always line up with those expectations. Some have dense housing but unclear hierarchies, some have monuments without a visible ruling class, some seem to have strong ritual importance without the usual signs of a centralised state. Some are permanent settlements, but not yet cities in the classic Mesopotamian or Egyptian mould. So when we ask whether the first cities were really first, we may be asking the wrong kind of question. The better one may be this: how many different kinds of large, organised human communities existed before the later definition of city became dominant? That question has become harder to avoid because scholars increasingly describe early urbanism as heterogeneous rather than uniform. The recent review in the Annual Review of Anthropology puts it plainly. Pre-modern urbanisation was more diverse than traditionally thought, with alternative forms of urbanism identified in many parts of the world. That is a dry academic way of saying something rather exciting. The old map had fewer routes than the real landscape. We expected one model and found many. We assumed cities must all begin by resembling the cities we already knew best, and then archaeology politely informed us that people in the past had not consulted our categories before arranging their lives. And this is where sites like Göbekli Tepe become so disruptive, even if they were not cities at all. That is precisely why they matter. Göbekli Tepe, with its monumental T-shaped stone pillars and striking carved imagery, predates the classic urban world by a great margin. UNESCO notes that the site preserves megalithic structures with decorative elements and craftwork that shed light on the societies who occupied it. What makes it especially revealing is not that it proves the existence of some lost super-civilization, because it does not, but that it shows large-scale, symbolically rich, labour-intensive construction taking place among communities much earlier than older models expected. There is active scholarly debate about how to interpret the site, including whether it was a purely ritual centre or part of a broader residential settlement. But either way, it demonstrates that substantial coordination and shared symbolic worlds existed before anyone would normally say the first cities had arrived. That last point is important because it changes the emotional balance of the story. In the older version, early humans spend a very long time being relatively simple, and then suddenly, once agriculture settles in and populations increase, everything becomes organised enough to produce temples, walls, elites, and administration. But places like Göbekli Tepe and settlements like Jericho and Çatalhöyük suggest that the capacities behind later urban life did not appear out of nowhere. People already knew how to gather labour, maintain places of repeated significance, build on a substantial scale, create shared symbolic systems, and live in durable communities. In that light, Uruk begins to look less like a thunderclap from an empty sky, and more like one dramatic outcome of much older tendencies. We should also be careful not to let the word first do too much work. In history, first often means earlier surviving example we currently understand well enough to classify confidently. That is not the same thing as absolute beginning. It is entirely possible, even likely, that there were forms of concentrated settlement, regional centrality, or organised communal life in places we have not yet excavated properly, in levels now destroyed, or along coastlines that vanished under post-glacial seas. Sea levels rose dramatically after the last ice age, and many of the most attractive zones for early settlement would have been near water, estuaries, and productive coastal environments. Some of humanity's earliest experiments in permanence may now be inaccessible or only partly recoverable. The archaeological record is not a fair sample. It is what survived flood, erosion, rebuilding, and luck. So the phrase first city may conceal an uncomfortable truth. It may only mean first city we still have enough of to argue about. There is a second reason the old model may have overpraised later cities at the expense of earlier settlements. Later cities leave behind the kind of evidence historians adore. Administrative tablets, standardised architecture, monumental precincts, craft districts, defensive works, and all the formal signs of civic life. Earlier communities often leave stranger evidence: clustered houses, burials beneath floors, unusual towers, walls whose purpose is debated, and symbolic art that refuses to explain itself in straightforward prose. The more a site resembles a later bureaucratic society, the easier it is for scholars to slot it into the story. The less it resembles one, the more likely it is to be described as transitional, proto, or not quite there yet. Those labels can be useful, but they also reveal a bias. We have often treated resemblance to later states as the measure of importance, which is a little like judging every animal by how successfully it approximates a horse. Çatalhöyük is a perfect example of that discomfort. Its houses were packed together with roof entry rather than streets in the later urban sense. There is no obvious grand palace, no clear central avenue, no king standing at the top of a carved staircase announcing municipal policy. For some scholars, that has made it difficult to call it a city. But perhaps the difficulty lies not with the site, but with the expectations. A large, dense, long-lived settlement of people who shared symbolic practices and complex domestic architecture may represent a form of organised life that does not fit the later state-centred model. If that is so, then insisting it is not a real city may tell us more about our definitions than about Neolithic reality. We keep asking why these places fail to look like later cities, when perhaps we should be asking why later cities became our standard in the first place. Jericho creates a related problem. A very early permanent settlement with striking communal construction is hard to square with the old picture of a slow, simple ascent towards serious architecture. Even the wall alone has inspired decades of debate about function, defence, flood management, labour organisation, and social coordination. Whatever precise interpretation one prefers, the existence of such construction that early tells us that communities without the full package of later urban institutions could still mobilise effort on a remarkable scale. That should make us more cautious about equating complexity only with formal statehood. People are capable of coordinating themselves for many reasons besides obeying a palace. Ritual, danger, prestige, memory, solidarity, and practical necessity can all move stone surprisingly well. Then there is the question of whether the earlier cities were always permanent in the way we imagine. Some scholars have become more interested in seasonal aggregation, repeated gathering sites, and forms of centrality that are not identical to year-round urban residence. A place can matter enormously without functioning like a later city every day of the year. It can be a centre for trade, ritual, negotiation, marriage exchange, memory, or communal labour during key times, and quieter the rest of the year. If early humans use space in such flexible ways, then our tendency to divide sites sharply into village, town, city, temple centre, or camp may be too rigid. The real social landscape may have included many hybrid forms. Not half-developed versions of the city, but alternatives to it. This is one reason recent archaeology has become less obsessed with asking whether a site qualifies in the purest sense, and more interested in what concentrations of people, institutions, and activities it hosted. That shift is subtle, but it matters. Once you focus on what a settlement actually did, rather than whether it earns the title city according to a later checklist, the story gets richer. Some places concentrated ritual, others storage, others craft production, others exchange, others political authority. Some combined several of these, some move between them over time. Urban life stops looking like a single invention and starts looking like a cluster of social solutions that emerged in different mixtures. And if that is the case, then the old search for the first city may have hidden a deeper truth. What came first may not have been the city as a finished form, but the repeated human tendency to create centres. Centres of gathering, centres of memory, centres of exchange, centres of ritual, centres of residence, centres of authority. Those centres could be large or modest, permanent or periodic, egalitarian or hierarchical, dense or dispersed. Some eventually became what later ages would recognise as cities, others did not. But the impulse behind them, to draw people and practices into a shared space and sustain that concentration over time, seems to be older than the classic urban package. There is also a very practical issue. What survives best in archaeology is not always what mattered most to those who lived it. A mud brick monumental precinct may preserve differently from a timber-built aggregation site. A stone tower may survive where a sophisticated social network leaves only hints. A site built, rebuilt, and occupied for centuries will often look more important simply because it accumulated more visible material. Yet importance in human life is not always proportional to architectural persistence. Some early centres may have been socially immense and materially modest. Others may have been politically central only briefly. Others may have mattered because they linked communities rather than because they dominated them. When we search for first cities, we risk favouring the loudest survivors. This is why the whole question has become less about replacing one champion with another and more about abandoning the race format entirely. Uruk remains crucial. Jericho remains extraordinary. Çatalhöyük remains difficult and revealing. Göbekli Tepe remains unsettling in the best possible way. None of these sites alone overturns history. What they do, taken together, is make the older progression look too narrow. They tell us that large-scale settlement, monumental effort, symbolic concentration, and social coordination all have deeper roots and more varied expressions than the old script allowed. The first cities, in the classic sense, may still be first for certain urban features, but they were not first in organisation, not first in complexity, not first in communal ambition, and certainly not first in making a serious mark on the landscape. Once you start thinking that way, later civilization begins to look less like a sudden achievement and more like a narrowing of possibilities into one especially durable and visible form. That is a very different feeling. Instead of a triumphant invention, the city becomes one branch of a much older human tendency to gather, build, symbolize, organize, and remember. It is still impressive, still transformative, still historically decisive, but it is no longer the clean beginning we once imagined. It has ancestors, it has prototypes, it has rivals. It may even have lost cousins buried under fields, hidden beneath later towns, or resting under coastlines no one can excavate without getting very wet and quite annoyed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Not that the first cities were not important, but that they may have inherited more than they invented. They may have stood on top of older ways of concentrating people and meaning, older experiments in social life, older landscapes of cooperation and memory that have mostly vanished from view. We tend to think of cities as the point where human history becomes visible. But what if that visibility is partly an illusion produced by survival? What if the deep past was already full of organised worlds, and the reason they seem faint is not because they were minor, but because time buried them more effectively than the cities that came later? That possibility lingers for a reason, and once it does, it becomes very hard not to start looking down at the ground itself a little differently, because so much of the human story may still be there, hidden in lost peoples and buried worlds. Once you start to suspect that the first cities were not as first as we were taught, another realization follows almost immediately. A great deal of the human past may not be absent because it never existed. It may be absent because it sank, rotted, burned, washed away, was built over or sat patiently under forest canopy, while later generations congratulated themselves on having finally discovered complexity. The phrase lost peoples and buried worlds sounds dramatic, and in a way it is, but it can also be misleading. Peoples are not always lost in the way old adventure stories like to imagine. Often their descendants are still here. Sometimes what was lost was not the people, but the visibility of their world. Their houses were made of materials that vanished, their coastlines drowned, their roads filled with sediment, their ceremonial spaces disappeared beneath roots and moss. Their names survived in oral memory while formal history ignored them. In that sense, much of archaeology is not the discovery of vanished humanity, so much as the correction of our own selective memory. We keep stumbling upon evidence that ancient lives were denser, broader, more organised, and more regionally varied than the surviving ruins alone would have suggested. The sea is one of the great editors of history. That sounds elegant, but it is not really elegant if you're trying to reconstruct 10,000 years of human settlement from land that no longer exists above water. A 2021 geoarchaeological review put the problem very plainly. Before sea level stabilised near its modern position around 7,000 years ago, most paleo shorelines and large areas of coastal hinterland had been exposed habitable land and were later drowned by post-glacial sea level rise. That means some of the zones most attractive to human beings, coastlines, estuaries, river mouths, productive shelves, sheltered inlets, are also some of the zones most likely to have vanished from ordinary archaeological reach. We are a coastal species in many practical ways. We like food, water, transport, and places where multiple ecosystems meet. If whole stretches of those landscapes disappeared, then whole chapters of early human life likely disappeared with them, or at least became much harder to read. That should make us cautious every time we speak too confidently about whether major developments of early human history did or did not happen. We are studying a record that has quite literally had its edges removed. Doggerland is perhaps the clearest European example of this problem, which may be why it feels so unsettling. Today it lies beneath the North Sea, but for millennia it linked Britain to mainland Europe as a real landscape of rivers, wetlands, plains and later woodland. Recent work reported by the University of Bradford, based on sedimentary ancient DNA from marine cores, suggests parts of Doggerland supported temperate trees such as oak, elm and hazel more than 16,000 years ago, and that some of the landscape remained above water as late as about 7,000 years ago. The same report notes evidence that parts of Doggerland survived even major flooding episodes, including the Storegga tsunami around 8,150 years ago. In other words, this was not merely a temporary land bridge people crossed once and forgot. It was potentially a habitable world for a very long time, with ecological conditions that could support Mesolithic communities. When that world drowned, it did not just separate Britain from the continent, it took evidence with it. The map changed, and then our story changed with the map, except we often forgot to mention that part, and Doggerland is only one example. In Southeast Asia, the now submerged landscapes of Sunderland remind us that enormous changes in habitable land once happened within spans that mattered to human communities directly. A 2023 study in communications biology argued that sea level rise reduced land area in this region by more than 50% since the last glacial maximum, with rapid rises linked to population pressure and migration. Even if one leaves aside the more detailed genetic arguments, the broader point is unavoidable. Vast inhabited territories that once connected areas now separated by sea were transformed beyond recognition. What looks to us like an archipelago may once have been a much more continuous social world. Routes that seem impossible now may have been ordinary. Neighbours who appear distant in modern geography may once have been linked by land, exchange and daily movement. If those landscapes vanished, then our inherited picture of how people spread, interacted and organised themselves may be based on a geography that is simply too late. We often tell history using the modern map, but the modern map arrived embarrassingly late to the story. This is one reason the phrase buried worlds is not only metaphorical. Some worlds are underwater, others are under jungle, others are inside tells and mounds created by centuries of rebuilding. Others lie beneath farmland, flood deposits, and the very cities that replaced them. Archaeology has always known this in a technical sense, but only recently have new methods made the scale of the hidden world harder to ignore. Remote sensing, sediment DNA, seabed mapping, and LIDAR have expanded the visible past in ways that are genuinely destabilizing for older narratives. They do not merely add details, they change proportions. A site once thought isolated becomes part of a network. A ceremonial centre turns out to be embedded in a larger managed landscape. A blank area on the archaeological map stops being blank and becomes crowded. There is something almost comical about this, in a very human way. We kept drawing clean maps partly because trees, mud, water, and later construction were in the way. Civilization did not always hide itself out of modesty. Quite often, it was just covered by other things. Take the Amazon, long imagined in older scholarship as a place where environment sharply limited large, durable social formations. That view has weakened dramatically. In 2022, a Nature paper on the Casarabe culture in the Bolivian Amazon used LIDAR to reveal what the authors described as a form of pre-Hispanic low-density urbanism. Two remarkably large sites of 147 and 315 hectares within a 4-tiered settlement system, connected by causeways and accompanied by canals, reservoirs, and monumental civic ceremonial architecture. The authors argued that this settlement pattern had not previously been described in Amazonia. Then in 2024, a science paper on Ecuador's Upano Valley reported a dense system of pre-Hispanic urban centres with roads and platforms, describing 2,000 years of what the authors called garden urbanism in the upper Amazon. Those are not tiny adjustments to the old picture. They are the sort of discoveries that force us to ask whether we were looking at the Amazon or merely at our own assumptions about what should count as urban, organised, or historically central. What makes these discoveries especially important is not just that they reveal forgotten sites, it is that they reveal forgotten landscapes. A few temples hidden in the trees would be interesting enough, but what LiDAR keeps showing in different regions is much broader. Roads, terraces, platforms, reservoirs, causeways, field systems, settlement clusters, and large-scale modifications of terrain. This means we're not merely rescuing isolated ruins from obscurity. We're recovering inhabited systems. People did not just place monuments in forests. They reshaped environments, moved through planned routes, managed water, and organised living spaces at scales earlier models often denied them. In the Amazonian case, the hiddenness of these societies was partly ecological and partly interpretive. Dense forests concealed the surface traces, but scholarly habits did the rest. Once the assumption settled in that tropical environments could not sustain certain kinds of complexity, evidence had to work harder to be seen. Now that it is being seen, the old confidence looks less like rigour and more like a shortage of imagination. The Maya world offers another lesson in this. For many years, scholarship focused most heavily on the major visible centres, temples, plazas, stelae, and known monumental cores. Reasonable enough, since those are hard to miss and far easier to document than everything in between. But newer remote sensing work keeps showing that the in-between was often not empty at all. A 2024 antiquity study on eastern Campeche describes one of the Maya lowlands' largest blank spots being tested with regional remote sensing, and it emphasises both the possibility of dense past settlement and the long problem of undermapped zones that had appeared in effect emptier than they really were. The article even notes that researchers have known since at least the 1940s that parts of Campeche were densely settled and heavily engineered, yet the broader authoritative map still showed large swathes as little more than terra incognita. There is something almost painfully familiar in that. We tend to confuse unsurveyed with unimportant. A lack of evidence on the map becomes very quietly evidence of lack. Then a new method arrives and the emptiness evaporates. A similar story unfolds at Angkor, though in a different ecological and historical setting. LiDAR work there showed that the visible temples were only part of a far wider urban landscape. The mapping revealed regular urban blocks, occupation mounds, ponds and structured spaces extending beyond the famous monument cores. It also reinforced a crucial point about preservation. Much of Khmer urban life had been built from non-durable materials, meaning that what survived for early scholars were primarily the temples, inscriptions and artworks, rather than the full-lived city. Later analysis of the LiDAR data mapped over 3,000 cisterns and used them to infer population density in central Angkor. What had seemed, from a more limited view, like a landscape dominated by temples turned out to be one of the most extensive low-density urban complexes of the pre-industrial world. Again, the people were not missing. Their visibility was. The fragile parts of the city perished, and for a long time scholarship mistook that partial survival for the whole. All of this should make us a little suspicious of the word lost. Lost to whom, exactly? Lost to the people who lived there? Not at the time. Lost to their descendants? Sometimes not even then. Lost to formal academic narratives? Very often, yes. There is an odd habit in modern historical storytelling, inherited partly from colonial scholarship and partly from popular adventure writing, of treating any society outside familiar literate or monumental traditions as though it had slipped off the human map entirely. But in many cases the real loss occurred later, when conquest, disease, displacement, state formation, or simple scholarly neglect severed our connection to knowledge that had once been local, continuous, and alive. The world beneath the forest or sea then appears mysterious, not because it was unknowable, but because the chain of recognition was broken. Lost civilization can therefore be a rather self-centered phrase. It sometimes means no more than civilization whose full scale we failed to notice, or civilization whose records we were not trained to read. That matters because once we accept how much is hidden, we also have to accept how skewed our surviving sample may be. The past has not been preserved fairly across climates, materials, and regions. Stone survives better than wood. Dryness preserves better than humidity. Elevated monumental cores are easier to map than dispersed wetlands. Empires that wrote on durable media look clearer than communities who encoded knowledge in performance, landscape, and repeated practice. A drowned shoreline leaves us with marine cores and difficult surveys instead of courtyards and burials. A tropical city built largely in perishable material may collapse back into vegetation, while its reservoirs and embankments wait centuries to be recognized from the air. So when we compare societies by what remains, we are not always comparing their achievements. We are often comparing the afterlives of their materials. That is a much less flattering exercise for our confidence in neat historical ranking. There is also a more intimate consequence. Entire categories we use to describe the past may have been shaped by what happened to survive best. If coastal foragers, fisher communities, and mixed subsistence societies flourished in places later drowned, we may be underestimating the role of maritime and littoral life in early human development. If tropical peoples built broad, low-density urban landscapes in earth, timber and managed vegetation, we may be underestimating how many forms urbanism could take. If repeated rebuilding turned settlements into layered mounds, we may be seeing the final stacked version, while losing the earlier phases that would have made the sequence look less clean. Buried worlds do not simply add missing examples to our existing timeline. They threaten to rearrange the timeline by changing what we think was common, what we think was rare, and what we think was even possible at a given moment. This is where the buried part of the story becomes almost philosophical. History often feels solid because it is built from what is visible: monument, tablet, wall, tomb, road. Yet visibility is a temporary condition. Forest can hide a city, sediment can hide a field system, water can hide a continent-sized shelf. One powerful method can make a whole category of past life newly visible, and with it, a new version of history. That should make humility a central historical skill. Not the theatrical kind, not the kind where everyone sighs and says the past is mysterious, but the practical kind. The kind that remembers absence of evidence is sometimes just evidence of bad preservation, bad access, bad methods, or bad assumptions. We are dealing with a species that lived almost everywhere, adapted constantly, and used materials that do not all survive equally well. There is no good reason to assume we have already found the full range of human worlds. There is every reason to assume we have not. What is especially striking is that the more hidden worlds we uncover, the less exceptional they begin to seem. At first, each revelation arrives as a surprise. A drowned landscape here, a jungle city there, causeways beneath canopy, engineered wetlands, hidden neighbourhoods around famous cores. Then the surprises begin to accumulate, and accumulation changes tone. It stops sounding like anomaly and starts sounding like pattern. Perhaps human history has always been denser than the clean surface view suggested. Perhaps whole populations, settlement systems and social experiments have been missing from the standard story not because they were peripheral, but because our methods and categories were calibrated to the wrong kinds of remains. Once that possibility settles in, it becomes difficult to trust the apparent emptiness of any ancient landscape. A blank on the map starts to feel less like a conclusion and more like a challenge. So the lesson here is not merely that there were lost places, It is that the disappearance of those places has consequences for every timeline we draw. If large stretches of early coastal life are underwater, if tropical settlement systems remained hidden until lidar, if perishable urban worlds decayed while their stone fragments monopolized attention, then the order in which history seems to appear may not be the order in which it actually unfolded. Some things may look late only because their evidence survived badly. Some things may look rare only because we have not found enough of them. Some societies may appear isolated because the connecting landscapes are gone. Once you really sit with that, chronology itself starts to loosen. The dates may remain, but the confidence around them shifts. Because if buried worlds keep returning to disturb the story, then the timeline we inherited may be less like a straight road and more like a patchwork laid over ground that is still moving underneath it, which is precisely where another problem begins to emerge: the feeling that the timeline itself has started to slip. And that is when the timeline starts to slip, not all at once, not in some dramatic cinematic collapse where the dates burst into flames and archaeologists run through museums clutching carbon samples, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. A layer is redated, a fossil is re-examined. A site once treated as marginal turns out to be older, larger, or more complex than expected. A new method arrives, and suddenly the old sequence looks less like a reliable staircase, and more like a set of penciled notes written in the margin by people doing their best with incomplete evidence. That is one of the most important things to understand about human history. The timeline is not the past itself. It is our current arrangement of the past, built from methods, assumptions, and surviving material. And whenever any one of those changes, the arrangement can shift. Sometimes only slightly. Sometimes enough to make entire generations of confident storytelling look rather optimistic. There is a natural temptation to think of chronology as the stable part. Interpretation may change, perhaps. One scholar sees trade, another sees migration, a third sees ritual exchange, and a fourth sees a committee that should have taken better notes. But the dates, surely, are the solid ground. Except they are not always solid either. Archaeological chronology depends on context, preservation, calibration, contamination control, and the relationship between one piece of evidence and the layer around it. A single site can be argued over for years because the question is not only how old something is, but what exactly is being dated. A seed, a footprint, a layer of sediment, a tool, a fire, a bone. Something older that was moved into a younger deposit, or something younger that sank downward. This is why timelines can feel so strangely alive. They are not merely read from the earth. They are constructed from evidence that has to be sorted, tested, compared, and argued over. And the better our methods become, the more often the old neatness begins to wobble. One of the clearest examples is the story of our own species. Not so long ago, many summaries of human origins placed the emergence of Homo sapiens at roughly 200,000 years ago, often with East Africa cast as the obvious and almost singular cradle. Then the Jebel Irhoud fossils in Morocco complicated that picture in a way that was difficult to ignore. The Nature paper reported remains with a mosaic of features consistent with early Homo sapiens, and dated them to roughly 300 or 15,000 years ago, while also arguing for a broader Pan-African evolutionary story, rather than one confined neatly to a single birthplace. That is not a tiny correction around the edges. It pushes the early phase of our species back by around 100,000 years, compared with older textbook versions, and changes the geography of the story as well. Suddenly the origin of modern humans stops looking like a moment in one corner of Africa, and starts looking more like a continent-wide process unfolding over a much deeper time span. Once that happens, the old beginning feels less like a fact and more like a convenience we had outgrown, and that pattern repeats. Europe for a long time was often narrated in relatively orderly terms when it came to the arrival of Homo sapiens and the transition into the Upper Paleolithic. Then Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria offered direct dates of around 45,000 years, for Homo sapiens remains associated with early Upper Paleolithic tools, animal remains, bone tools, and ornaments. The Max Planck summary put it plainly. The finds document the earliest known Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens and push back the start of that major cultural transition in Europe. Here again, the shift is not just about adding a little age, it changes overlap, contact, and sequence. If modern humans were present earlier than expected in this part of Europe, then the timing of interactions with Neanderthals, the spread of technologies, and the pace of cultural change all become less straightforward than older models suggested. The timeline does not simply extend, it loosens. Then there are moments when the slippage becomes almost public, because the revised dates are so startling that even people who do not usually spend evenings thinking about Pleistocene chronology suddenly notice. White Sands in New Mexico is one of those cases. The US Geological Survey reported that the fossil human footprints there date to around 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, and that follow-up work using two independent approaches reaffirm that same age range. If correct, and the current evidence strongly supports it, that places humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, thousands of years earlier than the older mainstream picture many people grew up with. In other words, the timeline of the peopling of the Americas did not just gain a new footnote, it was forced backward into a climatic period when older models would have said people either should not yet have been there or at least were not expected in that way. That is what I mean by slipping. A date moves, and suddenly whole migration narratives have to reconsider themselves. Routes, timing, adaptation, and even what counted as plausible all begin to shift. What makes White Sand especially interesting is that it also reveals something else about timelines. They are not revised only by new things being found, but by old skepticism being answered with better methods. The initial publication caused argument, which is exactly what one would expect when a site appears to challenge a long-standing chronology. Then the follow-up study added more independent evidence, and the case strengthened. This is the part people often miss when they imagine history as static. Archaeology is not a book being slowly filled in. It is more like a conversation between methods: radiocarbon dates, luminescence dates, environmental context, sediment studies, ancient DNA, isotope work, and material analysis all check, pressure, and occasionally embarrass one another. A timeline survives only as long as it continues to survive those tests, and increasingly some of the old ones do not. The same sort of disruption appears when we look not only at when humans were present, but at what they were doing. There was a time when very early woodworking, let alone structural woodworking, was assumed to be largely invisible or too fragile to tell us much. Then the Clambo Falls findings appeared. The Nature paper reported evidence for the earliest structural use of wood at least 476,000 years ago. That age matters for an obvious reason. It predates Homo sapiens. So now the deep human story includes earlier hominins intentionally shaping wood and fitting pieces together in a structural way much earlier than most older summaries would have dared claim with confidence. The effect is subtle, but important. We are reminded again that the timeline of technological and cognitive possibility is often older than the standard educational version. Things we once treated as late achievements of fully modern people keep revealing deeper roots. The farther back we look, the less comfortable it becomes to assume that sophistication arrived on schedule. And perhaps that is the deepest discomfort of all. The timeline slips not only because dates move, but because the meaning of earlier periods changes. If Homo sapiens are older and more geographically distributed within Africa than once thought, then the origin story becomes more diffuse. If modern humans were in Europe earlier, then cultural transitions become less sudden. If humans were in North America during the last glacial maximum, then the peopling of the Americas becomes more complex. If structured woodworking reaches back nearly 500,000 years, then we must be more cautious about associating planning, design, and complex material engagement only with later humans. None of these revisions destroys history. they do something more awkward. They remove the comfort of late arrival. They suggest that many capacities, movements, and experiments began earlier, overlapped more, and unfolded less tidily than the textbook ladder preferred. Ancient DNA has made this feeling even stronger. Before archaeogenetics became such a powerful force, prehistory was often narrated through pottery styles, tools, burial practices, and inferred cultural influence. Movement of ideas could be separated, at least in theory, from movement of people. Sometimes this was wise, sometimes it became a habit. Then genome-wide analysis began showing that in certain periods, very large-scale shifts in ancestry really did occur. The Max Planck work on southeastern Europe described how farming spread into Europe from Anatolia around 8,500 years ago with a movement of people, and how incoming farmers and local hunter-gatherers interacted in different ways across regions. A separate review on ancient DNA and migration emphasizes that major shifts in ancestry over large areas were linked to the spread of farmers, new forms of pastoralism, transport technologies, and other major prehistoric transformations. Suddenly, chronology was not just about when a new pottery style appeared. It was also about when whole populations mixed, moved, or changed in demographic weight. The timeline became more biological as well as archaeological, and it started telling a less comfortable story about continuity. That has had enormous consequences for how scholars think about Europe in particular. For a long time, many archaeologists were understandably cautious about using migration as the explanation for every cultural change. Older forms of archaeology had overused such narratives, often in crude and politically dangerous ways. But ancient DNA has forced the pendulum back toward complexity. Cambridge's discussion of migration through ancient DNA notes that population-scale genomic analysis can now address long-standing questions about diversity, movement, and continuity, and points to cases like the Beaker complex in Britain where the genetic turnover was far greater than many had expected. The same discussion emphasizes that demographically transformative population movements can now be identified at key moments in prehistory. In other words, the timeline of cultural change and the timeline of population movement do not always match the gentler, more gradual stories people preferred in reaction to older invasion models. Sometimes the data say that large shifts really did happen, and then the sequence has to be rewritten yet again. The step story is a good example of how startling that can be. The Max Planck summary of the 2015 ancient DNA work describes Eastern ancestry as absent in sampled Europeans before around 4,500 years ago, and then present in every single sample after that point in the dataset they were discussing. That kind of pattern is remarkable because it sharpens chronology dramatically. It is not just that some influence arrived from the step, it is that the genetic evidence can mark a major threshold in a way that older typologies alone could not. Whether one is talking about language spread, pastoralism, or demographic transformation, the timeline here stops being a vague cultural haze and becomes a much more abrupt rearrangement. This is one reason so many older certainties are being reconsidered. We are no longer relying on one line of evidence. We are layering dates, genes, isotopes, settlement patterns, and material culture together, and sometimes they refuse to support the older neatness. There is something almost philosophical in all this. We like timelines because they give the illusion of certainty. Place the events in order, and the past begins to behave. But order is not the same as understanding. Human history is full of long overlaps, delayed consequences, survivals, returns, and experiments that do not become visible at the moment they begin. A technology may exist long before it becomes common. A population may arrive long before its descendants dominate a region. A cultural form may spread without simple replacement, then later be joined by large demographic change. A site may be occupied early, then forgotten, then reoccupied, then misunderstood. What we call a turning point is often just the moment surviving evidence becomes dense enough for us to notice. The real turning may have started much earlier, in quieter ways, among people whose traces did not preserve quite as conveniently. And that, I think, is why this part of the story feels so destabilising. Because once the timeline starts to slip, you can no longer rest comfortably inside the old sequence of simple, before, complex, after. The dates still matter, perhaps more than ever, but they stop behaving like tidy signposts. Instead, they begin to look like moving markers placed in fog, each one useful, none of them final. Homo sapiens becomes older and less neatly localised. Europe's transitions become earlier and messier. The Americas become peopled earlier than many older models allowed. Woodworking and structural planning appear deeper in time than expected. Population histories turn out to include more movement, more mixture, and sometimes more abrupt shifts than older narratives were willing to admit. At that point, the question is no longer whether a few dates need adjusting. It is whether the whole rhythm of human history has been misheard. So the slipping timeline is not just a technical problem for specialists with dating labs and very intense opinions about stratigraphy. It changes the emotional structure of the past. It tells us that the accepted sequence was never as final as it sounded. It tells us that beginnings may be older, transitions may be slower or stranger, and major changes may have multiple phases instead of one clean moment. Most of all, it tells us that history is not revised only at its edges. Sometimes the centre moves too, and once you have seen that happen often enough, once you have watched the dates themselves become more fluid than the old story promised, it becomes much easier to take seriously another category of evidence that has made people both fascinated and nervous for centuries, the bits of ancient knowledge that seem to appear in the record a little earlier or in a slightly more sophisticated form than we expected them to be there at all. The phrase ancient knowledge that shouldn't be there is useful only if we handle it carefully, because it can send the mind running in two unhelpful directions at once. The first is condescension, the idea that ancient people could not possibly have known certain things because, in our private ranking system, they had not yet earned that level of competence. The second is fantasy, the idea that whenever old humans did something impressive, the explanation must lie somewhere outside ordinary human intelligence, perhaps in forgotten super-civilizations, impossible outsiders, or a great cosmic tutoring service that, rather suspiciously, never left paperwork. The more responsible and much more interesting explanation is usually simpler. The knowledge was there because people were there, and people, even very early people, were observant, practical, social, and good at passing techniques along. What shouldn't be there is not the knowledge itself. What shouldn't be there is our surprise. That surprise tells us less about the ancient world than it does about the narrow expectations we brought to it. One of the clearest places where this old underestimation falls apart is symbolic work. For many years, symbolic behaviour was treated as something that bloomed rather late, almost as if early Homo sapiens wandered around being biologically modern, but culturally hesitant, waiting for a green light from history before they began drawing, marking, storing meaning outside the body, or treating materials as more than useful objects. That story has aged badly. At Blombus Cave in South Africa, researchers reported a 73,000-year-old abstract drawing made with ochre on stone, which nature described as the earliest known example of a drawing. The same site had already produced evidence of an ochre processing workshop, about 100,000 years old, preserved with abalone shells used as containers and compounds mixed from ochre and other ingredients. That is not merely decoration drifting in from nowhere. It suggests planning, material preparation, recipe-like behaviour, and a willingness to invest labour in things that carry social or symbolic weight beyond immediate survival. Once you have people selecting materials, grinding them, mixing them, storing them, and using them to make marks, the old image of a dim symbolic dawn starts to look rather unfair, and that is before we even widen the map. In Sulawesi, recent dating has pushed rock art into very deep time, A 2026 Nature paper reported a hand stencil with a minimum age of 67,800 years, while a 2024 Nature paper on the same broader region found a narrative composition at least 51,200 years old, describing it as the earliest known surviving example of representational art and visual storytelling. That wording matters. A hand stencil already tells us something about intention, presence, and symbolic practice. A composed scene of human-like figures interacting with animals tells us something else as well. That people were arranging images into meaningful relationships, not simply leaving isolated marks behind, as if they had spilled pigment and called it a day. If visual storytelling and representational scenes are this old, then one of the habits we need to abandon is the idea that early humans first mastered survival and only much later learned to externalize memory, identity, and narrative. The evidence suggests those capacities were already well underway. The mental world was not waiting for civilization. Civilization, such as it later became, inherited a mind that was already working at full strength. That same correction applies to what we might call external memory. A 2026 PNAS study argues that people in Europe 40,000 years ago had developed a system of conventional signs based on analysis of recurring geometric markings on mobile objects and cave surfaces. It is important not to oversell this. The study does not say Ice Age Europeans had writing in the later Mesopotamian sense, and we should resist the urge to leap from intriguing signs to full proto-cuneiform with mammoth bones. But the argument is still significant. It suggests that some repeated markings were neither random doodles nor purely decorative, but part of a shared system for encoding information visually. That is exactly the sort of thing older stories often reserve for much later societies, as though the storage of meaning outside speech only begins once fields are measured and tablets are taxed. What this newer work implies is more modest and, in a way, more profound. Humans were experimenting with visual conventions for organizing and transmitting information long before cities, kings, or scribal schools. The road to writing may not have begun in one clean revolution. It may have begun in many small acts of repeated marking by people who were already trying to make thought portable. The same pattern appears in technology, especially when the surviving evidence happens to come from materials that normally decay and therefore almost never get the respect they deserve. Consider fibre is the sort of thing that underpins daily life once discovered. String, rope, nets, bags, bindings, garments, traps, perhaps eventually components of boats, shelters and tools. Yet because fibre usually rots away, we often talk about its importance in broad, vague terms, like someone describing the existence of socks without ever having seen a sock drawer. Then, in 2020, researchers reported direct evidence of Neanderthal fibre technology in the form of a 3-ply cord fragment made from inner bark fibres attached to a stone tool. The paper argued that twisted fibre technologies imply not only manual skill, but complex multi-component technology and an understanding of ordered combinations. That is a remarkable reminder of how much invisible competence may be missing from the deep record. Once you can twist fibres into durable cordage, you have crossed into a technical world of combinations, tensions, uses, and repeatable methods. And if Neanderthals were doing this, then once again the problem lies not with the evidence appearing too early, but with our habit of expecting too little from people who left fewer durable things behind. Adhesives tell a similar story, though with an extra layer of quiet sophistication. For years, birch tar associated with Neanderthals was discussed as one possible marker of complex behaviour. Then the details became more interesting. A 2023 study on the Königsauer birch tar pieces argued that Neanderthals did not use the simplest method, but rather a process involving an intentionally created underground environment that restricted oxygen flow and remained invisible during production. The author suggested this was one of the clearest indicators of cumulative cultural evolution in the European Middle Paleolithic. That phrase matters a great deal. Cumulative culture is not just doing a clever thing once. It is developing a process, improving it, transmitting it, and building on earlier methods. In ordinary language, it means people learned, remembered, and refined. And that is exactly what the old deep history script too often denied earlier humans. It imagined clever moments, but not sustained technical traditions. Yet tar production, especially by a non-simple method, looks very much like the kind of practical chemistry that grows inside social learning. No mystery required. Just attention, repetition, and generations of people noticing what works. Navigation is another category where ancient knowledge can seem almost unreasonably advanced, but only because modern people tend to underestimate how much planning the open sea demands. Reaching Sahul, the Ice Age landmass linking Australia and New Guinea, required crossings through Wallacea. A 2017 Nature paper on Majid Beb reported human occupation of northern Australia by around 65,000 years ago, and the assemblage included grinding stones, ground ochres, reflective additives, and ground edge hatchet heads. A 2019 modelling study then argued that the first peopling of Sahul required multiple maritime crossings, at least one approaching 100 kilometres, and concluded that anatomically modern humans had the capacity to plan open sea voyages lasting several days by at least 50,000 years ago. That is not a casual drift on a lucky current. That is a package of skills, watercraft, route choice, timing, group coordination, and enough confidence to head toward land you may not yet see. We often speak of seafaring as though it belongs naturally to later historical peoples, with harbours and named captains. But crossing Wallacea means that long before formal navigation schools and nice folded charts, humans were already solving the practical problem of how to move across dangerous water on purpose, and it did not stop there. A 2020 scientific report study examined the peopling of the Ryukyu Islands and argued that migration there between about 35,000 and 30,000 years ago could not be explained by accidental drift. The islands involved were small, low, and in some cases beyond the horizon, while the Kuroshio Current remained a major obstacle. The authors concluded that this colonisation required active and continued exploration backed by technological advancement. That is a useful corrective to a very persistent habit in older accounts of prehistory, which is to attribute successful movement to accident whenever intention would force us to credit ancient people with too much foresight. Sometimes humans really did get somewhere because storms carried them. But if you repeatedly colonise islands across difficult currents, then at some point the word accident begins to look less like caution and more like reluctance. The people making these crossings were not merely brave, they were informed. They had enough environmental knowledge to judge currents, weather, craft, and destination well enough to try again. And trying again, in human history, is usually where real knowledge lives. Even what counts as advanced equipment turns out to need revision. The Majid Beb evidence matters here again because ground edge hatchet heads that early force a rethink of technological timelines many people learned in simplified form. We are accustomed to treating the deep Paleolithic as a time of rough stone and broad categories, then saving refined composite or specialised tool traditions for later. But the actual record increasingly shows repeated pockets of precision, preparation, and adaptation appearing much earlier than expected. Grinding stones mean deliberate processing. Reflective additives imply choices about materials beyond the strictly necessary. Ground edge tools require work, patience, and a reason to invest that effort. This is what ancient knowledge often looks like before writing. Not a theorem on a tablet, but a chain of repeated decisions preserved in wear, residue, and form. A tool is not just an object, it is frozen judgment. Someone knew which stone to select, how to shape it, how long to grind it, where to use it, when to carry it, and perhaps who was allowed to make one. Enough of those judgments together, and you are not looking at isolated cleverness. You are looking at a knowledge tradition. Medicine belongs here too, though with a note of caution, because the deeper we go into prehistoric care, the more carefully we have to separate good evidence from eager storytelling. Still, some patterns are hard to dismiss. Reviews of trepanation, the deliberate opening of the skull, note archaeological evidence from prehistoric contexts across multiple regions and periods, making it the oldest surgical procedure for which we have direct material evidence. We should not romanticize this. Ancient surgery was not a gentle spa treatment involving herbal tea and good lighting. Nor should we assume every drilled or cut skull means successful medicine in the modern sense. But the existence of such interventions, sometimes with signs of survival, tells us that ancient communities observed injury, attempted treatment, and in some cases carried out difficult procedures with enough skill for the patient to live afterward. That implies anatomical understanding, however partial, practical courage, however alarming, and social care significant enough to spend time on a difficult body instead of walking away. Knowledge is not always elegant. Sometimes it arrives with risk, rough tools, and a rather intense expression. Even so, it is knowledge. What ties all these examples together is not mystery, but accumulation. Knowledge that shouldn't be there usually turns out to have one of two explanations. Either we assume the capacity was invented later than it really was, or we assume that earlier evidence would look more familiar than it does. The first error is chronological, the second is aesthetic. We imagine knowledge as something that ought to resemble us. Text, diagrams, institutional instruction, standardized tools, specialists with titles, perhaps a very serious room and a shelf. But most human knowledge existed for the vast majority of our history without any of that packaging. It lived in repeated actions, shared marks, bodily training, apprenticeships, rituals, seasonal timing, remembered routes, and objects that only look mute because we no longer belong to the communities that made them. Once you accept that, the archaeological record changes tone. A 3-ply cord is no longer just a curiosity. It is evidence of instruction. A tar lump is no longer only residue. It is evidence of process. A hand stencil is no longer a handprint left in leisure. It is evidence of symbolic intention inside a social world. And suddenly the ancient past begins to look less like a storehouse of surprises and more like a storehouse of underread intelligence. There is another reason these findings matter. They do not simply push isolated achievements backward. They also challenge the old ranking system that tied sophistication too tightly to agriculture, urbanism, and writing. The PNAS work on conventional signs suggests complex visual encoding among hunter-gatherers. The Sulawesi art pushes storytelling and image-making far back before cities. The cordage and tar evidence show deep technical reasoning among Neanderthals. Maritime crossings into Sahel and the Ryukyus imply route planning, craft skill, and cooperative decision-making long before the first ports we would comfortably call civilized. In other words, many of the mental habits we once treated as products of civilization look increasingly like preconditions for it. Cities did not create human intelligence. They concentrated some of its outputs. Writing did not invent memory outside the mind. It standardized one particularly durable version of it. Formal science did not create close observation. It institutionalized habits of observation that humans had been relying on for tens of thousands of years to avoid hunger, drowning, injury, and embarrassment. This is why I think the better emotional response to ancient knowledge is not shock but respect. The people in the deep past were not guessing their way through an empty world. They were learning dense, demanding environments with the full seriousness that survival requires. They were also doing more than surviving. They were storing meaning, refining methods, organizing labor, encoding information, and extending knowledge beyond one lifetime through teaching and repetition. Some of what they knew was practical, some symbolic, some technical, some social, and most likely the boundaries between those categories were not nearly as strict as ours. A pigment could be useful and symbolic. A voyage could be economic and sacred. A cord could be a tool, a garment component, a net, a measure, a status marker, or all of them at once. Ancient knowledge was not primitive because it lacked our labels. It was often integrated in ways we no longer expect, and once you begin to see that, another pattern becomes much easier to understand. Human beings have long preserved difficult truths inside stories, rituals, symbols, and repeated images. Sometimes those survive as practical instruction. Sometimes they survive as memory with the explanation missing. Sometimes they survive as myth, which means that when later ages inherit fragments of very old knowledge without the original context, they do something humans have always done. They turn those fragments into stories that refuse to disappear. And this is where the past becomes especially difficult to handle, because once the material evidence begins to loosen the old timeline, we find ourselves standing beside another archive entirely. Not stone, not bone, not pollen, not charcoal, but story. Myth. Oral tradition. The things modern historical culture has often treated with a strange mixture of affection and condescension, as if stories were charming decorations around the edges of real knowledge rather than one of the oldest systems human beings ever built for storing it. That does not mean every myth is a disguised chronicle, or that every dragon should now be filed under zoology. It means something both simpler and more demanding. Myths refuse to die because they do work. They hold landscapes in memory. They encode danger. They preserve relationships between people and place. They carry ancestry, obligation, taboo, and warning. In oral cultures, knowledge is not just information floating around casually for anyone to pick up. It can be formal, socially controlled, and central to physical and social life. Cross-cultural work on oral cultures has emphasized exactly that point. Oral tradition is not mere entertainment, but one of the major ways small-scale societies store and transmit essential knowledge. For a very long time, literate societies trained themselves to mistrust that kind of memory whenever it reached too far into the past. The usual assumption was that oral traditions might preserve useful events for a few generations, perhaps a bit longer if the community was especially disciplined, but certainly not enough to matter to deep history. Yet that assumption has become harder to defend. A 2023 study on Tasmanian Aboriginal oral traditions argued that the longevity of orality can exceed 10 millennia, and that such traditions provide crucial information for understanding the archaeology of oral societies. Other recent work on deep-time oral tradition is more cautious in tone, but still acknowledges that some myths about geological and astronomical events may be reliably tied to events thousands of years old. That should not make us gullible. It should make us less lazy. If a tradition is bound tightly enough to place, repeated often enough, and held within a culture where formal transmission matters deeply, then the old habit of dismissing it as too old to matter begins to look less like rigour and more like impatience. Sea level rise is one of the clearest examples of this, partly because it gives us something unusually rare in deep-time oral tradition, a broad environmental process we can date independently, and compare against stories tied to specific coastlines. Patrick Nunn's recent work on human observations of Lake Quaternary coastal change argues that culturally grounded stories from Australia and northwest Europe plausibly recollect land loss, submergence, and isolation linked to post-glacial sea level rise. Cambridge's discussion of the deep past of pre-colonial Australia summarises earlier work by Nunn and Reid, noting that they collected 21 coastal Aboriginal oral histories around Australia, and argued that these stories collectively preserve memory of coastal inundation, going back between roughly 5,300 and 11,120 BCE. That does not mean every sea story is a documentary report, and it certainly does not mean all flood myths everywhere point to a single event. It means something quieter and more impressive. In some places, communities appear to have preserved cultural memory of changing shorelines over periods modern historical culture once assumed possible. That matters because coastlines are among the most emotionally charged and practically important landscapes humans inhabit. When the sea takes land, it does not merely alter topography, it changes routes, food sources, sacred places, burial grounds, boundaries and identity. Stories about the land once extending farther out, about islands once joined, about dangerous waters covering former country, may therefore be doing several things at once. They may be cosmological and historical, sacred and practical, symbolic and geographic. Modern categories can make that hard to recognise because we like to separate myth from memory as if one excludes the other. Oral cultures do not always behave that way. A story can explain the world and preserve a real environmental change at the same time. In fact, that may be one reason such stories last. They are not carried forward as neutral data points. They are made meaningful enough to survive. This is part of why work on oral cultures stresses the formal social role of tradition rather than treating it as casual folklore. Volcanoes offer another revealing case, perhaps even more dramatic because eruptions are often highly memorable, locally devastating, and sometimes datable with enough precision to test the endurance of oral memory. A 2024 study in quaternary research on the geography of volcanism in oral traditions notes that traditions describing eruptions and their effects survive across the inhabited world, and specifically points to the Klamath people's stories about the eruption of Mount Mazama, which formed Crater Lake about 7,600 calibrated years ago. The study's broader point is not that every volcanic myth can be mapped neatly onto a geological event, but that catastrophic eruptions often generate traditions durable enough to remain culturally significant for immense spans of time. A 2020 study on volcanism in Aboriginal Australian oral traditions makes a similar case in another context, arguing that ethnographic evidence preserves indigenous understandings of volcanism, and that some such stories may be of great antiquity. Again, the important correction is not mystical, it is methodological. Stories about fire mountains and transformed landscapes should not be treated automatically as quaint inventions once there is serious reason to think some preserve observations of real geological events. The temptation, of course, is to go too far in the other direction and start reading every myth as a code waiting to be cracked by modern enthusiasts with too much confidence and not enough restraint. That is not helpful either. Not all myths are memories of actual events. Some are moral structures, kinship maps, ritual frameworks, political claims, cosmological explanations, or literary creations that organise reality without preserving a datable incident inside them. A 2022 commentary in Behavioural and Brain Sciences makes this plain in a different way by noting that imaginary worlds are pervasive in forager oral tradition. Human beings are imaginative creatures. We do not tell stories only to archive empirical facts. We tell them because stories train attention, bind groups, regulate behaviour, and make complex social worlds manageable. So the serious position is neither crude dismissal nor credulous decoding. It is to ask, case by case, what a tradition is doing, how it is transmitted, what landscape it is attached to, what social authority surrounds it, and whether independent lines of evidence make parts of it historically plausible. Once you approach myth that way, one of the oldest scholarly embarrassments becomes difficult to ignore. Literate societies have often assumed that because they wrote their stories down, their relationship to history was superior. Yet writing changes stories too. It freezes one version. It privileges the scribe, the court, the temple, the victor, the institution that can afford storage and enforcement. Oral traditions, by contrast, are often dismissed as unstable because they remain living performances rather than archived texts. But living does not mean careless. In some societies, exactness matters intensely. Authority to tell certain stories is restricted, and place anchors the narrative so firmly that distortion becomes difficult without social consequence. The Cambridge chapter on Native American oral traditions emphasises that oral text can be crucially observant of place, and that written collection often captures only a partial version of traditions whose full meaning depends on performance and context. That is a useful warning. When modern historians say myths refuse to die, they often imagine stubborn irrationality. Sometimes what they are really seeing is the survival of a different archival system. Flood stories are perhaps the most famous case where all these issues collide. They appear in many regions, often with enough emotional force that people have repeatedly tried to turn them into evidence for one universal catastrophe. That is probably too simple. Floods are common, terrifying and socially transformative. River floods, storm surges, tsunamis, glacial outbursts and coastal inundation have shaped human memory in many places. A recent Archaeology and Oceania article on Aboriginal flood narratives in the Kimberley shows how such narratives can hold multiple layers of memory and interpretation at once. Elsewhere, recent work on paleo-tsunamis along Canada's Pacific coast explicitly highlights how geological evidence can be augmented by archaeological and anthropological data, reminding us that coastal disaster histories are often best understood when material traces and tradition are read together rather than against one another. So when flood myths recur, the safest conclusion is not that they all descend from one single primeval flood, nor that they are all invention. It is that water leaves profound cultural scars, and communities often build stories strong enough to carry those scars across generations. There is another reason myths persist, and it has less to do with memory alone than with power. In oral societies, knowledge can be one of the main sources of authority. Who may tell a story, in what place, at what time, to whom, and with what ritual framing can matter enormously. The Cambridge work on knowledge in oral cultures makes exactly this point. Control of knowledge is often a major source of power where wealth and force are less visibly concentrated. That means myths are not merely inherited by accident. They are curated, guarded, and tied to social life in ways that help explain their durability. A story linked to a route, a fishing ground, a kinship duty, or a ceremonial obligation is not easily discarded simply because a later outsider finds it implausible. It remains alive because it is woven into the structure of life. This, in turn, helps explain why myths so often outlast the political systems, language forms, or settlement arrangements that first gave rise to them. Institutions can collapse. A story attached to country and repeated with authority may endure much longer. That endurance becomes especially interesting when modern researchers find that stories once mocked as fanciful align unexpectedly well with environmental or archaeological evidence. It does not mean the story is proven in every detail. Stories are not laboratory reports. But it does mean the old hierarchy between literate history and oral tradition becomes harder to maintain. The 2024 Quaternary Research Study on Volcanic Traditions, for example, argues that many eruptions with catastrophic social consequences were likely memorable enough to form enduring oral traditions. None studies of coastal change make a related argument for shoreline loss and inundation. Together they suggest that myth can preserve observations of the world on timescales mainstream historical culture long considered unrealistic. The important shift here is one of attitude. Instead of asking whether myths can possibly contain old knowledge, scholars increasingly ask under what conditions such knowledge survives, how it is transformed, and how to evaluate it ethically and critically. That is a much better question, and a much humbler one. It also helps us understand why myths so often seem to resist correction. From the outside, a story may appear factually outdated, impossible, or metaphorical. From within the community that carries it, the story may still organise land rights, moral behaviour, ritual timing, or collective identity. In that case, its survival does not depend on matching the categories of modern science point for point. It depends on usefulness, authority, repetition, and place. This is one reason myths are frequently layered. A single tradition may contain an old environmental memory, a later political claim, ritual meaning, and poetic imagery all at once. Trying to separate those into neat boxes can become a very modern sort of misunderstanding. The story persists because it keeps being able to mean several things at the same time. Historical cultures built on documents often dislike that ambiguity. Oral cultures have lived with it for millennia. There is also a warning here for anyone too eager to make myth serve only archaeology. Stories are not valuable merely when they confirm something a lab can verify. The risk in modern enthusiasm for oral tradition is that we begin to praise indigenous or ancient narratives only when they align with evidence outsiders recognise as scientific. That repeats an old mistake in a newer tone. A tradition does not become important only when it can be recruited as accidental geology. It may matter because it preserves relationship, law, sovereignty, grief, belonging, and moral orientation. The Cambridge chapter on Native American literature is especially useful on this point because it argues that oral texts are both literary and historical, and that their performative life cannot be reduced to a written extract. That is a needed reminder. Myths refuse to die not because they are failed science waiting to be decoded, but because they are socially alive. Occasionally and fascinatingly, that life also carries historical memory much deeper than modern scholars once expected. And perhaps this is where the whole conversation becomes most unsettling for conventional history. We like to imagine that as societies become more advanced, they move from myth into history, from story into record, from memory into document. But that progression may itself be a myth. Literate states did not eliminate myth. They institutionalized their own versions of it. Origins, divine mandates, chosen peoples, heroic founders, righteous conquests, civilizing missions, sacred lineages, national destinies. These are myths with archives attached. They look more official because they are written down, but they can be just as selective, political, and identity-making as any oral tradition. The difference is that literate powers are often better at calling their stories history and everyone else's stories legend. Once you notice that habit, you begin to see that what survives as the official version of the past may depend less on truth than on which group managed to preserve, impose, and circulate its preferred story most effectively. That thought matters because it prepares us for the next turn in the road. Myths that refuse to die tell us that memory can outlast landscapes, states, and methods of record. But they also remind us that not all memories get equal authority. Some are written into chronicles and taught as fact. Others are left in ceremony, place names, songs and stories, and treated as peripheral until science catches up enough to become impressed. The human past is full of narratives, but only some of them become official. And once we admit that, the question becomes less about why certain myths endured and more about who got to decide which stories counted as history in the first place. Because that is where the past stops being only a matter of survival and starts becoming a matter of power. There is a sentence people like to repeat when they want to sound wise about the past. History is written by the victors. It is a good sentence. Sharp, memorable, compact enough to fit comfortably into a documentary voiceover or the margins of a notebook beside a cup of coffee gone cold. But it is also slightly too neat. The past is rarely organised by winners alone. Very often it is written by the survivors, and survival is a much stranger thing than victory. Sometimes the survivors are empires. Sometimes they are archives. Sometimes they are materials. Sometimes they are stories. Sometimes they are the people who stayed long enough to name the ruins after everyone else had gone. And sometimes the survivors are not the strongest at all, only the luckiest, the driest, the most heavily baked, or the most successfully protected from insects, fire, conquest, flood, and official disinterest. That matters because when we open the record of the past, we are not opening the past itself. We are opening what remained available to later generations. That sounds obvious, but most of us do not feel it strongly enough. We treat the historical record as though it were a broad democratic sample of former life, with a few regrettable gaps here and there. In reality, it is a very biased collection. Some voices survive because they held power. Others survive because the medium happened to last. Others disappear because their keepers were conquered, their books were burned, their temples dismantled, their language suppressed, their settlements drowned, or their memory dismissed as folklore until someone from a university arrived centuries later and finally looked impressed. The most sobering part is that these biases begin at the level of material itself. Clay survives differently from bark paper. Stone survives differently from wood. Fired tablets can endure where libraries of other kinds vanish almost without trace. The British Museum notes that when Nineveh was destroyed in around 612 BCE, the fire that consumed the city baked many of Ashurbanipal's clay tablets harder, making them some of the best preserved documents from Mesopotamian history. It also notes that before the discovery of that library, almost everything modern scholars knew about ancient Assyria came from the Bible or classical historians, whereas the tablets allowed Assyrians to speak in their own words. That is an extraordinary example of accidental survival shaping memory. A catastrophe that destroyed a city also preserved part of its voice. If those texts had been on a more fragile medium, our image of Assyria would be poorer, narrower, and even more dependent on outsiders' accounts. And once you notice that, you begin seeing the same pattern everywhere. States with durable record systems tend to look disproportionately central in history, because they left behind exactly the sort of evidence historians can quote with a pleased expression. Tax accounts, decrees, land grants, temple inventories, royal boasts, legal cases, tribute records, diplomatic correspondence. It is not that these materials are unimportant. They are invaluable. But they come with a built-in perspective. They show what institutions cared to count, regulate, punish, glorify, and preserve. They tell us a tremendous amount about power. They're often less generous when it comes to everyone living under it. If you want to know what a kingdom wanted remembered, archives are wonderful. If you want to know what ordinary labour felt like, what women remembered in households, what mobile communities knew about landscapes, what conquered people said to one another after the officials had gone home, or how ritual and memory worked outside the formal record, the archive can suddenly become very quiet. Not empty exactly. Quiet in the way a room becomes quiet when one person has been allowed to do nearly all the talking. That is why the phrase history written by the survivors may be better than history written by the victors. Victory suggests a dramatic moment of conquest. Survival is more ongoing, more structural, more embedded in what endures. A text survives because it was copied. A monument survives because it was maintained or forgotten in the right soil. A chronicle survives because a monastery kept it dry. A legal code survives because a later regime found it useful. A people's own account does not survive because their books were burned or their language was reorganized under foreign rule. Sometimes what we call the official story is simply the story whose storage conditions were best. The colonial archive makes this even clearer, because there the bias is not only material but openly political. A recent Cambridge chapter on colonial Nigeria describes archives as uniquely constructed and preserved, and says plainly that colonial archives were used as tools to extend colonial power while shaping historiography through consequential and deeply problematic methods. The same chapter also stresses the importance of alternative sources beyond the dominating Eurocentric framework, including oral traditions, rituals, customs, festivals, and local written records such as the Kano Chronicles. That is a very useful corrective. It reminds us that archives do not merely hold history, they help produce a particular kind of history, one often aligned with the state, its administrators, and the categories through which it governed. That pattern is not unique to Nigeria, of course. Colonial power all over the world had a habit of producing extensive paperwork about the peoples it controlled while simultaneously weakening, filtering, or devaluing those people's own systems of memory. Officials counted populations, categorized tribes, mapped territories, renamed places, summarized customs, and often mistook administration for understanding. Later, historians then inherited those papers as sources, and sometimes forgot to ask what the archive had been built to do in the first place. An archive assembled to tax, pacify, classify and rule is not a neutral witness. It is closer to an instrument panel from a machine of control. Useful, yes. Essential, often, but not innocent. This is one reason oral tradition matters so much, and also why it has so often been mishandled. The Cambridge History of Native American Literature notes that orally transmitted indigenous texts were often collected and edited under conditions of colonial re-education and cultural trauma, and argues that such narratives are both literary and historical, crucially observant of place and land, and often only partially intelligible when reduced to written extracts alone. That is a remarkable sentence, in effect, because it turns the old hierarchy upside down. The problem is not that oral traditions are too unstable to count as history. The problem is that written colonial collection practices often strip them of performance, context, authority, and land-based meaning, then blame the traditions for appearing incomplete. In other words, the survivors are not only those who endure physically, they're also those who control translation. A story taken down by a missionary, colonial administrator, ethnographer or court recorder may survive, but not in a neutral form. It survives already mediated, already framed, already pushed through categories that may not fit it. So even when marginalised voices enter the record, they often do so wearing borrowed clothes. The written version may preserve them and distort them at once. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in historical work. Preservation is not the same as faithful transmission. A voice can survive and still arrive altered. Sometimes, of course, it does not arrive at all. The destruction of archives is one of the most brutal ways history is shaped, because it removes not merely objects but possibilities of memory. In Mesoamerica, the effect was devastating. The Metropolitan Museum notes that although the Maya probably created hundreds, if not thousands, of illuminated screenfold books, only 4 pre-conquest Maya codices survive today. Smithsonian Magazine, discussing Maya decipherment, describes the burning of hundreds of codices under Diego de Landa, and notes again that only 4 are known to survive. The Library of Congress similarly notes that after the conquest of the Aztec Empire, Spaniards burned the Aztec archives, and that surviving examples of indigenous codices are rare. When we speak of the histories of the Maya or Aztec worlds, then, we are speaking from within a silence created not by time alone, but by deliberate destruction. Whole traditions of astronomy, genealogy, ritual knowledge, administration, land rights, and narrative memory did not simply fade, they were attacked. And that should change the emotional tone with which we read what remains. If only 4 Maya codices survive from what was once a far larger corpus, then every surviving text from that world bears an absurd burden. It has to stand in for what was lost. The same is true whenever conquest destroys a people's records, and later historians must reconstruct their world from fragments, hostile accounts, archaeology, and survivals in ritual or oral tradition. The surviving archive becomes not representative but accidental. It may still be precious, it may still be rich, but it is no longer safe to treat it as proportionate. There is also a cruel irony in this. Societies that depended heavily on perishable writing materials or oral transmission were often treated as less historical, precisely because later violence made their records harder to recover. Then those same societies are compared unfavourably to empires whose clay, stone, or parchment happen to survive in greater quantities. It is a bit like burning someone's library and then accusing them of not having read enough. The imbalance is then folded into textbooks until it begins to look natural. Even where no conqueror is involved, preservation can still produce strange hierarchies. Royal inscriptions survive because they were carved into stone. Everyday conversation does not. A boundary marker survives because someone made it last. Domestic knowledge carried in voice, gesture, and repeated practice often disappears with the people who lived it. What that means is that history tends to overhear the formal and underhear the ordinary. Kings sound louder than shepherds not only because they were kings, but because shepherds did not usually commission basalt reliefs of their opinions. This is one reason the past so often appears more centralised than it may really have been. The archive has a weakness for administration. Bureaucracy loves duplication, storage, lists and durable marks. Institutions that rule by record keep records about ruling. So historians inherit a world in which the state appears everywhere because it was so fond of writing down its presence. But the actual human world around that state may have been far messier, more negotiated, more local, and more resistant than the surviving papers suggest. Villages may have remembered things differently. Oral networks may have carried parallel truths. Ritual life may have preserved older structures beneath official law. Yet the official version often reaches us first because officialdom was simply better at filing. And there is another level to this. Survivors do not merely preserve their story, they often rename everyone else's. Conquerors classify the conquered. Colonial regimes define tribal categories, property systems, and ethnic distinctions in ways later generations mistake for ancient realities. National states do something similar when they search the past for ancestors, arranged neatly enough to support a modern flag. Religious institutions do it when they cast earlier traditions as darkness, idolatry, error, or prefiguration. Once the naming power belongs to the survivors, the archive begins organising the moral structure of history as well as its facts. That is why alternative voices matter so much and why they are so often hard to hear. They may survive in songs, ceremonial routes, landscape names, genealogies, local chronicles, seasonal practice, or stories outsiders once dismissed as legend. They may also survive archaeologically in ways the written record never anticipated. Settlement patterns, dietary traces, objects reused in households, shrine continuities, informal craft traditions, things women made but officials never mentioned, the long endurance of local ritual under imperial language. In many regions, the real historical work now lies in putting those quieter forms of evidence back into conversation with formal archives rather than letting the archive rule alone. This is delicate work because one does not solve archival bias simply by reversing it and distrusting every written source. That would be silly and also exhausting. Archives are indispensable. The point is not to reject them, but to ask better questions of them. Who created this record? For what purpose? What did it need to notice? And what could it afford not to notice? Who appears only when they become a problem for authority? Who speaks directly? And who is spoken about? What kinds of labour are visible? What kinds of suffering are normalised into silence? What languages are missing? What has to be reconstructed from outside the page? Once you start asking those questions, the whole atmosphere of history changes. A census stops being just a census and becomes an instrument of ordering. A missionary account stops being just description and becomes a negotiation between curiosity, judgment, and power. A royal inscription stops being transparent evidence and becomes political theatre in durable form. And an oral tradition stops being a charming supplement to the real archive and becomes an archive of another kind, one that may preserve land, memory, and continuity where paper did not. It also becomes much harder to tell the old story of progress without flinching, because if history is written by survivors, then what we often call the rise of civilization may in part be the rise of those institutions best able to preserve themselves and best able to damage rival memory systems. Writing is powerful, but so is the court that protects scribes. Archives matter, but so does the state that funds storage. Monuments endure, but so do the labour arrangements that built them and the later regimes that chose not to erase them. Preservation itself is political more often than we like to admit. That is one reason the deep past can feel more honest in some strange way. There, where the archive thins and material survival becomes erratic, we are forced to admit uncertainty. We cannot pretend to hear only the state, because there often is no state speaking clearly enough to dominate the record. We have to rely on bones, houses, isotopes, landscapes, stories, marks, residues, and stubborn fragments. Later historical periods tempt us back into overconfidence because documents arrive in heaps. But a heap of documents is not the same thing as a complete account of human life. It may simply be a heap left by the people who had the means to heap. So when we say history was written by the survivors, we should probably hear several meanings at once. It was written by those who endured politically, by those who controlled storage and education, by those whose materials lasted, by those whose languages became standard, by those who destroyed rival archives, by those who translated others into their own categories, and sometimes, very movingly, by those who survived outside the archive altogether and kept carrying memory in forms the official record could not fully absorb. That double truth is what makes the past so difficult and so human. On one side are the great surviving institutions, their tablets, chronicles, codices, decrees, inscriptions, and carefully managed memory. On the other are the people whose worlds remain partly visible only through archaeology, oral tradition, ritual continuity, or the strained edges of records written by someone else. If we forget that imbalance, we end up mistaking survival for importance and power for truth. If we remember it, the past becomes less tidy but far more real. And once it becomes real in that way, another question begins to emerge almost on its own, because after enough silences, enough missing books, enough filtered voices, and enough histories built from what survived conquest and accident, it becomes impossible not to wonder whether the past itself may be far stranger than the official version ever allowed. What if the past was far stranger than we have allowed ourselves to believe? Not stranger in the loud, brightly packaged way people sometimes mean when they say that. Not stranger because every old stone wall must hide a secret machine, or because every gap in the record demands a lost world of impossible technology and very dramatic lighting. That kind of strangeness is easy. It is entertainment dressed as revelation. The more difficult kind is quieter. It asks whether the past was stranger because real human life, over thousands upon thousands of years, may have taken forms we no longer expect, forms that do not fit our categories, flatter our assumptions, or lead neatly toward the institutions we happen to know best. That possibility is less theatrical, but in a deeper sense it is far more disturbing, because it means the human story may not have been a march. It may have been a field of experiments. That is a very different thing to sit with. A march implies direction. A field of experiments implies possibility, failure, variation, return, dead ends, temporary brilliance, forgotten solutions, and social arrangements that appeared, worked for a time, and then disappeared so completely that later history began speaking as if they had never existed. We are accustomed to imagining the past as a narrower version of the present. Fewer people, simpler tools, smaller institutions, less knowledge, less reach. But what if that picture is wrong in the most basic way? What if the past was not narrower, but wider? What if it contained more social forms, more regional worlds, more ways of organising life, more approaches to memory, hierarchy, land and cooperation than the surviving record easily reveals? In that case, the strangeness of the past would not come from exotic impossibility. It would come from abundance. Too many ways of being human, not too few. One reason this is hard to imagine is that modern societies are addicted to standardization. We like systems, we like metrics, we like things that can be mapped, categorized, filed, and compared. Even our imagination tends to move in standardized ways. We picture villages, then cities, then states. We picture religion, then law, then empire. We picture technology climbing rung by rung toward the present. The story is manageable because the shapes are familiar, but familiarity is not proof. It is often just comfort in disguise. The human species has existed for such a long time, across such varied environments, under such different climatic and social pressures, that it would actually be surprising if everyone had arranged life in the same broad sequence we were taught in school. The strange thing may not be that the official story has holes. The strange thing may be that we ever expected one clean story to contain us at all. Think for a moment about how little of human life survives in the form later historians prefer. Laws survive, boundaries survive, tombs survive, storage jars survive, the voice of an official survives, especially if it was carved into stone or pressed into clay by someone who knew it might matter to power. But ordinary habits, emotional rhythms, local categories, seasonal rules, forms of cooperation, temporary gatherings, practices tied to song, gesture, initiation or place, these often survive only faintly, which means that the past can easily look more rigid than it really was. Later historians see the things that fossilise best and assume those things were central. Yet a society's deepest organising principles may be the very things least likely to survive in durable form. The architecture remains. The logic that made the architecture meaningful does not always remain with it. That is one reason ancient settlements can feel so strange when we look closely enough, not because they are mysterious in a supernatural sense, but because they do not always behave the way our theories want them to. A large settlement appears without obvious palaces. Monumental construction appears without the sort of visible ruling apparatus we expected. Dense communities emerge with symbolic worlds that do not line up neatly with later religion, later politics, or later social class. Trade routes connect places modern maps make us think of as distant. Ritual sites gather people before the familiar package of urban civilization has officially arrived. In one region, hierarchy hardens early. In another, large-scale coordination seems to remain more distributed. In one period, mobility is a sign of adaptation and sophistication. In another, permanence is. We keep looking for one rhythm and finding many. That alone should make the past feel stranger than the official version. But there is something else. Human beings are perfectly capable of forgetting, abandoning, and then reinventing things. We often tell the history of knowledge as though useful ideas, once discovered, simply accumulate forever in a pleasant upward stack. This is not how real societies work. Skills can vanish. Trade networks collapse. Materials become unavailable. Ritual knowledge is lost if transmission breaks. Environmental shifts render old strategies useless. A people may know a landscape intimately for millennia, then lose access to it. A technique may survive in one region and disappear in another. A language can preserve categories that vanish when the language is suppressed. What this means is that the deep past may contain not only origins of things we recognize, but entire lineages of knowing that ended. It may have held practical intelligence so tied to place or community that when those worlds broke apart, the knowledge did too. That kind of loss is hard for modern minds to picture, because we are so used to external storage. We assume that once humans know something, someone writes it down, backs it up, uploads it, teaches it formally, and preserves it in institutions. For most of human history, none of that existed in the forms we now rely on. Knowledge lived in people and the relationships between them. It lived in repeated practice, apprenticeship, oral tradition, ritual, and seasonal timing. This gave it flexibility and depth, but also vulnerability. If enough of the social world around that knowledge disappeared, the knowledge could disappear in ways that leave almost no trace. And if that happened often enough across tens of thousands of years, then the past may be full of absences that are not primitive gaps but lost competencies. There is something deeply unsettling about that. It suggests that history may not be a gradual climb from less to more, but a restless movement in which gains and losses are scattered unevenly across time. A people from 10,000 years ago may have known more than a people from 5,000 years ago about one landscape, one ecology, one way of moving, one set of fibres, resins, currents, medicines, or social obligations. A later state may have had better records but poorer local memory. A city may centralise administration and lose a way of reading weather once held by more mobile communities. Progress in one domain may coexist with narrowing in another. Once that becomes imaginable, the past grows stranger not because it starts to look magical, but because it stops behaving like a single competition with one winner. It may even be that some ancient forms of social life would feel not merely unfamiliar to us, but conceptually difficult to describe. We tend to divide societies into categories such as egalitarian or hierarchical, nomadic or settled, tribal or urban, sacred or political. These are useful words up to a point. Beyond that point, they become a trap. Real human communities can mix these features in ways that resist our clean oppositions. People can be mobile and deeply territorial. They can be seasonally hierarchical and otherwise relatively equal. They can build substantial monuments without creating a permanent ruling class in the later sense. They can live densely without streets, govern locally without a state, encode law in ritual rather than legislation, or separate power across age, ceremony, kinship, and gender in ways a modern institution would struggle to diagram. If many such arrangements existed, then much of the past may be strange simply because it was organised according to logics we no longer share. And then there is the strange persistence of human imagination itself. We often picture earlier periods as more literal, more practical, more trapped by necessity. But everything we know suggests that human beings have long lived in worlds thick with symbol, obligation, taboo, memory and story. People did not move through landscapes as empty resource zones. They moved through named places, ancestral places, dangerous places, blessed places, places where something happened, where someone changed, where a rule applied, where a being was remembered, where a route was proper and another was not. In that sense, ancient worlds may have been denser than ours, not emptier, more charged with meaning, more structured by relationships we would now call symbolic, legal, ecological and spiritual all at once, because our categories split what older lives often held together. That is another kind of strangeness modern historical narratives tend to flatten. They describe ancient people in material terms because material evidence survives, then act surprised when symbolic complexity keeps turning up earlier than expected. But symbolic complexity is not an optional extra humans gradually added after they solved food and shelter. It seems to have been part of being human for a very long time, which means the deep past may have been crowded with systems of significance we can only partly recover. Not because they were vague, but because they were precise in ways that depended on communities, languages, gestures, songs, and ceremonies that no longer exist in recoverable form. Imagine how strange our own world would appear if all future historians were storage units, road signs, fragments of advertisements, and a few surviving hymns. They would see that meaning existed everywhere, and still fail to understand most of it. We should extend the same humility backward. What if the past was also stranger environmentally than our inherited narratives allow? For most of human existence, the world's coastlines, climate zones, animal populations, forests, grasslands, and river systems did not match the ones we carry around in our heads when we imagine the globe. Land bridges existed, shorelines extended farther out, rivers behaved differently. Productive landscapes now lie underwater. Places that now seem isolated were connected. Places that now seem central may once have been peripheral. Human communities were not living on the planet we know. They were living on earlier versions of it, moving through geographies that no longer exist in the same form. That alone should make their lives more difficult for us to picture accurately. We keep using the modern map as though it were ancient truth, when in fact it is one late stage in a constantly shifting world. If the geography was stranger, then the human story built on that geography was almost certainly stranger too. And perhaps the strangest possibility of all is that many ancient people did not think they were early. That sounds obvious, but it is worth holding on to because modern history is full of unspoken arrogance. We imagine the past is incomplete because it came before us. But those people lived in complete presence. They had ancestors, expectations, traditions, political problems, arguments, jokes, fears, and routines. They were not standing at the beginning of a timeline labelled civilization. They were inside their own world, one already dense with memory and already old from their point of view. A community living 5,000 years ago may have looked back across stories and sacred places that already felt ancient to them. A monument we think of as early may have been, for its builders, part of a world saturated with inherited significance. The deeper we go, the more likely it becomes that every beginning we identify was built on earlier histories already meaningful to the people living them. This is one reason the real past may feel stranger than speculation ever manages. Speculation likes sharp mysteries. Who built this? Why did that disappear? What secret caused the collapse? Real history tends to reveal something much messier. Layers of use, reuse, adaptation, partial forgetting, borrowing, ritual persistence, political reinvention, landscapes that are never simply occupied once, but returned to, renamed, sanctified, abandoned, and reinterpreted. A stone circle may mean one thing to those who raised it, another to those who inherit it, another to those who bury their dead nearby centuries later, and something else again to the antiquarian who arrives much later and decides, with great confidence, that it clearly proves whatever he already believed. In that sense, strangeness accumulates. The past is not merely foreign because it is old. It is foreign because every age layered itself over the previous one without ever completely erasing it. The official historical story has usually tried to reduce that layering into clear epochs: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Ancient, Classical, Medieval, Early Modern. These are useful containers, but they also encourage a false neatness. Real lives do not begin and end when labels change. Old ways endure into new periods. New practices appear before historians are ready to name them. Peripheral regions do not shift in perfect synchrony with political centres. Some places preserve older forms longer. Others leap into new arrangements rapidly. There are survivals, mixtures, revivals, and local exceptions everywhere. Once again, the past looks less like a sequence of rooms and more like overlapping weather systems. You can map them broadly, yes. But the closer you stand to the ground, the harder it becomes to say exactly when one ended and another began. There is also the question of scale. A great deal of historical storytelling operates at the scale of kingdoms, migrations and civilizations, because that is where the surviving evidence often looks largest. But human strangeness may be most visible at smaller scales. A valley with its own rules, a coastline with inherited navigational knowledge held by a few lineages, a forest region whose settlements do not resemble the urban core a few hundred kilometres away, a ritual route known only through performance, a seasonal gathering site whose importance far exceeds its permanent population. When historians look mainly for large centralised forms, they can miss the fact that human life was often organised through dense local systems that were entirely serious without ever becoming states. The world may once have been full of such systems. Some may have interacted loosely, some competitively, some through trade, marriage or conflict. Taken together, they would create a human past much more variegated than the simplified civilizational map implies. And once you grant all of that, an unsettling reversal takes place. The present begins to look less like the natural culmination of history and more like one surviving arrangement among many others that once existed. Our institutions feel solid because we inhabit them. Our categories feel inevitable because we teach them. But if the past was far stranger, then what survives now may not be the endpoint of some universal developmental law. It may simply be what lasted through a particular series of climatic shifts, demographic expansions, technological consolidations, empires, religions and states. Other ways of arranging life may have been equally human, equally intelligent and equally stable for long periods, only without leaving behind the same volume of stone, text and bureaucracy. That is a humbling possibility. Also, perhaps, a useful antidote to modern self-importance. It helps explain why ancient evidence so often produces two equally misguided reactions. One is dismissal. These people were simple, so this evidence must be misread. The other is exaggeration. This evidence is impressive, so these people must have possessed impossible powers. Both reactions are forms of refusal. They refuse to accept that ordinary humans, over immense spans of time, were capable of creating social and technical worlds different from ours without being either primitive or superhuman. But that middle ground, the ground of real human strangeness, is exactly where the most interesting history lies. People were clever without being modern, organised without necessarily being state-like, symbolic without leaving texts, technically skilled without factories, observant without formal science, historical without archives in the later sense. The past does not need to become magical to become surprising. It only needs to be allowed to be itself. That may be why so many modern myths about lost civilizations take hold in the first place. They are crude attempts to answer a real intuition. People sense that the official story is too simple. They notice the gaps, the underestimation, the strange monuments, the deep memory, the recovered landscapes, the shifting dates, the knowledge appearing earlier than expected. Then, instead of accepting the more difficult possibility that human history was genuinely diverse and only partly preserved, they leap into fantasies that restore certainty by making everything secretly one thing, one source, one hidden master culture, one dramatic explanation. But real strangeness is usually plural. It does not reduce, it multiplies. It says there were many worlds, many experiments, many forgotten arrangements, and many ways to be fully human long before later civilizations declared themselves the proper measure of it. So perhaps the past was far stranger than we thought, because it was less like a staircase and more like a crowded landscape at dusk. Fires in different places, paths crossing and disappearing, settlements rising, moving, returning, stories carrying memory farther than the archive, knowledge surviving in hands, roots, songs, marks and rituals, people building dense worlds that later history barely noticed, other people losing worlds to water, forest, conquest, or simple neglect. Timelines shifting because what looked empty was not empty at all. The strangeness lies not in breaking the laws of reality. It lies in how much reality our older stories fail to hold. And once that settles in, once the past becomes not a neat origin story, but a vast territory of missing voices, hidden systems, abandoned knowledge, and human possibilities more numerous than we were taught to imagine, the final question becomes unavoidable. If the old version of history was too narrow, if our ancestors were experimenting far more widely than we admitted, if buried worlds and surviving myths and shifting dates all point toward a human story larger than the official account, then we may need to do more than correct a few details. We may need to rethink, quite seriously and from the ground up, where we came from at all. So perhaps rethinking where we came from begins with a very small correction to a very old habit. We need to stop treating origin as a point. We like points because they are easy to mark on maps and timelines. Here is where our species began. Here is where civilization began. Here is where history began. It makes the past look organised. But again and again, the evidence pushes us away from points and toward processes. The emergence of Homo sapiens no longer looks like a single clean event in one isolated place, and the history of our species no longer looks like a set of separate cultural boxes that occasionally bump into one another. Recent work in ancient DNA and archaeology has made human history look more braided, more mixed and more regionally entangled than older models allowed. At the same time, research on early urbanism has moved away from trait checklist definitions and toward a recognition of very diverse urban trajectories across time and place. The broad lesson is the same in both cases. Human origins, biological and social, seem less like a single launch and more like a long formation. That matters because most of us inherited a story in which where we came from had a suspiciously tidy answer. We came from simple beginnings, then learned to farm, then formed villages, then built cities, then became civilized. Before that, there was preparation. After that, there was progress. It was a useful outline, but it confused sequence with truth. It made it seem as though there were only a few moments that counted, and that everything important arrived in the right order. Yet once the dates start moving, once older sites become visible, once submerged landscapes and hidden settlement systems begin to appear, once oral traditions start aligning with environmental memory in ways scholars used to dismiss, the outline loses its authority. It is still a summary, but no longer a reliable map of how many different ways humans were already living, remembering, and organizing themselves. In that sense, the question is no longer only where did we come from geographically, it is also where did we come from intellectually, socially, and morally. Did we come from a ladder of advancement, or from a long series of experiments in being human? The answer increasingly looks like the second. Ancient DNA research has reshaped the history of migrations, mixture, kinship, and demographic change so extensively that one major review simply describes human histories as intricate and reticulate. That is not a poetic flourish. It is a technical way of saying that clean lines are failing. Populations separated, mixed, moved, and reconfigured. Cultural change was sometimes gradual, sometimes abrupt, and not always tied to the same kinds of movement in every place. If even our biological history looks more networked than linear, it becomes much harder to keep telling a social history in which one type of society simply replaces another in a calm upward march. And once we let go of the ladder, many older misunderstandings begin to look less like facts and more like habits. We thought mobile peoples must have been simple because they did not leave heavy ruins. We thought oral peoples must have had shallow memory because they did not leave written archives. We thought early settlements that lacked palaces or clear state institutions were somehow not fully there yet. We thought sophisticated symbolism, planning, long-distance navigation, and technical refinement belonged later in the story than they actually seemed to. But again and again, the evidence has gone in the opposite direction. The world before formal civilization had a name was already full of coordination, memory, environmental knowledge, symbolic life, and social intelligence. The problem was not that these things were absent. The problem was that we were looking for the wrong formats. This is why rethinking where we came from also means rethinking what counts as inheritance. We tend to imagine inheritance as something passed down by states, canons, official religions, and written traditions. But much of what made humans capable of later civilization did not originate there. It came from much older capacities, observation of season and place, shared symbolic systems, teaching through repetition, technical skill preserved in hands rather than books, the ability to coordinate labour around a common goal, the ability to make memory social so it can survive an individual lifetime. The evidence from oral tradition and archaeology now shows that some ritual practices and environmental memories can endure across astonishing lengths of time when they are tied tightly enough to place and transmission. At Clogg's Cave in Australia, archaeologists working with Gunai elders traced an ethnographically documented ritual practice back 11,000 to 12,000 years, describing this as roughly 500 generations of cultural transmission. In British Columbia, Lildwat oral traditions have been shown to preserve detailed observations of eruption, flooding, and landscape change linked to Mount Meager. Those are not decorative leftovers from history. They are history carried differently. That may be one of the deepest changes required here. We have to stop treating writing as the moment human beings become fully historical. Writing matters enormously, of course. It extends storage, administration, and exact record in ways oral systems do not duplicate. But it is not the beginning of memory, law, symbolic order, or seriousness. It is one powerful technology among others. Before writing, people still tracked obligations, encoded danger, maintained ritual continuity, preserved place-based knowledge, and taught complex practice over long periods. Some of that memory was more vulnerable than text. Some of it was more resilient because it remained socially alive rather than sitting in a room waiting to burn. If we keep equating history only with what literate states could preserve, we will continue mistaking one archival system for the whole human story. Rethinking where we came from also means becoming more careful with the word civilization. For a very long time, it was treated almost like an exam humans eventually passed. Cities, writing, centralized authority, monumental architecture, surplus, social hierarchy, formal administration. Once those boxes were checked, civilization had arrived. But current archaeological work on urbanism has become increasingly uncomfortable with that old checklist. Recent comparative work explicitly argues that archaeology reveals urban dynamics, emerging independently in diverse environmental and cultural contexts, and that older trait list definitions struggle to capture global variability. That is not a minor methodological quarrel. It changes the shape of the story. It suggests that concentrated, organised human life may have emerged through multiple routes, with different mixes of scale, infrastructure, centrality, inequality, and landscape connection. In that case, where we came from cannot be answered by pointing only to one corridor of development and pretending it was universal. This wider view has an effect on the present as well, because it removes the flattering assumption that our current arrangement was inevitable. If the past contained more social forms than we allowed, then the modern state-city industrial package is not the natural conclusion of human development. It is one surviving outcome among many, a durable one certainly, a powerful one beyond question, but not the only possible destination encoded in our species from the beginning. Other ways of organising life may have been stable for long periods, deeply knowledgeable and fully human without looking like precursors to us. Some may have been lost to conquest, others to climate change, others to absorption, translation, or simple neglect in the historical record. But their disappearance does not prove their inferiority. It proves only that survival is selective. That is where the decolonizing dimension of this question becomes unavoidable. For centuries, powerful societies described others as earlier versions of themselves. Mobile peoples were called primitive. Oral traditions were called unreliable. Monumentless landscapes were called empty. Tropical environments were treated as incapable of sustaining serious complexity. The archive of empire then helped preserve those judgments. But archaeology has been steadily undoing that damage. Hidden landscapes in Amazonia, the diversity of early urbanism, the deep antiquity of ritual continuity, and the value of indigenous knowledge in reconstructing environmental history all point in the same direction. The past was not arranged in a queue waiting for Europe, the state, or the archive to explain it. It was already crowded with histories. We simply inherited institutions that were better at hearing some of them than others. There's also something more personal in all this. When people ask where we came from, they often mean more than migration or chronology. They mean what kind of creatures we are. Are we naturally hierarchical or capable of many forms of cooperation? Are cities our destiny or one strategy among others? Is inequality the price of complexity, or simply one repeated solution with very mixed results? Are we defined most deeply by conquest and state power, or by the far older capacities to share knowledge, adapt to landscapes, form obligations, and carry memory through time? The archaeological record does not answer those questions with slogans, which is unfortunate for anyone trying to make a short speech at a conference. But it does suggest that humans have always been more flexible than the simple historical script allowed. We have moved in and out of different ways of living together. We have centralized and dispersed. We have accumulated power and also stored meaning in more distributed ways. We are not one historical type. We never were. If that is true, then origin starts to mean something broader than birthplace. It becomes a layered inheritance. We come from African evolutionary processes that were likely more distributed and complex than older single origin stories implied. We come from long traditions of mobility, exchange, and mixture. We come from oral worlds that could preserve memory far deeper than literate prejudice once allowed. We come from communities that shaped land, ritual and social life long before formal states. We come from multiple experiments in concentration, settlement and urban form, rather than one authorized urban beginning. We come from lineages of knowledge that were practical, symbolic, ecological and social at the same time. And we also come from loss, drowned coastlines, burned codices, broken chains of transmission, erased names, translated stories and archives built by those who survived powerfully enough to make their version look final. That last part matters because rethinking where we came from is not only about expanding pride, it is also about recovering humility. It would be comforting to discover that all the new evidence merely pushes the official story backward a little while leaving its shape intact. But the shape itself seems to be changing. The old picture gave us a narrow sequence with a few key thresholds. The newer picture is broader and more difficult. It contains overlapping thresholds, repeated inventions, regionally distinct trajectories, and memory systems outside the archive. It contains societies that do not fit the tidy boxes and pasts that survive only in fragments. That makes the story harder to teach in one sitting, which is perhaps why older versions lasted so long. But it also makes the story more honest. And honesty, even in history, is worth a little inconvenience. It also changes the way we think about evidence itself. Once the official story begins to loosen, every kind of evidence has to become more conversational. Genetics cannot simply overrule archaeology. Archaeology cannot simply ignore oral tradition. Texts cannot simply dominate because they are written. Landscapes matter. Sediment matters. Migration models matter. Indigenous knowledge matters. Urban history has to be compared across wider frameworks, and prehistory has to be read with more respect for local continuity and deep time transmission. Recent archaeological and decolonial work has been pushing in exactly this direction, arguing for approaches that are more collaborative, more open to indigenous knowledge, and less dependent on inherited colonial categories. That does not make the past easier. It makes it harder in the best way. It forces us to work with a richer record and fewer convenient prejudices. So where did we come from? The most honest answer now may be that we came from more than one kind of beginning. We came from biological emergence, yes, but also from social inheritance that long predates states and writing. We came from networks rather than lines, from mixture rather than purity, from adaptation rather than a fixed plan. We came from worlds that were already old to the people living in them. We came from landscapes, some of which no longer exist in their former shape. We came from memories preserved in bodies, roots, ceremonies, objects, and stories as much as in documents. We came from many local histories that were later compressed into one official global narrative, because one narrative is easier to print than many. That may be unsatisfying if one wants a simple origin story. But it is a far better description of a species as restless, inventive, and unruly as ours. And perhaps the final correction is this. We should stop asking where we came from as though the answer were only behind us. Human origins are not merely a buried event. They are an ongoing argument about what we choose to count as human significance. Every time archaeologists recognize a hidden landscape, every time a DNA reveals a history of mixture where people expected purity, every time indigenous knowledge reshapes the interpretation of a place, every time an old definition of city or civilization fails to hold, we are not just learning new facts about the past. We are adjusting the boundaries of who we think we have always been. That is why these revisions matter so much. They are not academic decorations. They change the human image. So maybe the calmest and most radical way to say it is this. We do not come from a straight road. We come from a crowded landscape of experiments, continuities, losses, recoveries, and survivals. We come from people who observed more than we gave them credit for, remembered more than we thought possible, moved farther and mixed more often than older histories like to admit. and built worlds whose full logic we can still only partly see. We come from many beginnings layered over one another, some visible, some drowned, some written down, some carried in story, some still waiting under soil, forest and sea. And once that begins to feel normal rather than shocking, the past stops looking like a prelude to us and starts looking like something much larger, something we are still only beginning to enter properly, even now.